There is a particular kind of quiet that comes at night when a show you love has become something you barely recognize. You remember exactly what it felt like when you first found it. The characters felt like people you knew. The humor felt like it was written by someone sitting in the room with you, someone who had thought carefully about what was funny and what was too far, and how to hold both of those things in productive tension. And then, slowly, without any formal announcement, without any single episode you could point to and say there, that was where it changed. It started to shift. A degree warmer in one direction here, a little darker there. A joke that landed with a small frown instead of a laugh, and then the next one that brought you back, and then another one that pushed just a little further than the one before it. And before long you looked up from what you were watching and thought, when did this happen exactly? When did this get like this? And more than that, why? Those questions turn out to have real answers, not simple answers, not answers that fit comfortably into a paragraph, but real ones, grounded in specific decisions made by specific people under specific pressures across a specific number of years. The story of how Family Guy became more offensive every season is not a mystery. It is a history. And histories, when you understand them clearly, illuminate things that matter well beyond the particular subject at hand. That is the story of Family Guy. And it is one of the most fascinating, strange, and genuinely instructive slow burns in the history of American television. Settle in wherever you are right now. Get comfortable. Let the texture of this voice be something you drift along with, rather than something requiring active effort. We are going to trace the full journey of how one of the most beloved animated comedies ever made became one of the most reliably controversial shows on television, season by season, decision by decision, character by character, humor shift by humor shift. By the time we arrive at the end, you will understand exactly how it happened and why understanding it matters not just for anyone who cares about Family Guy, but for anyone who cares about how comedy works, how creative institutions drift, and how the things we watch shape the things we think. Section 1. The DNA of the show, where it started and what it was built on. Before anything else, before the controversies and the boundary pushing and the 20-plus years of debate about what crosses the line and what constitutes genuine satire and what is just shock for its own sake, before all of that, you have to understand what Family Guy was when Seth MacFarlane first pitched it to Fox in the spring of 1998. You have to understand it clearly and specifically, because the entire story of how it changed depends entirely on understanding how different the original thing actually was. Not different in tone only, or different in content only, but different in its fundamental structure, in what it was trying to do and why and how those goals shaped every decision made within it. The show that exists today and the show that premiered in 1999 share names, voices, character designs, and a fictional Rhode Island setting. In almost every other meaningful respect, they are different programs. That is not hyperbole. It is the observation that the transformation of these shows, traced carefully, reveals a shift large enough that the two versions of Family Guy are more usefully understood as related shows than as the same show at different points in its history. Before anything else, before the controversies and the boundary pushing and the debate about what crosses the line, you have to understand what Family Guy was when it began. Because the entire story of how it changed depends entirely on knowing how different the original thing was. Seth MacFarlane pitched his concept to Fox in the spring of 1998. He was 24 years old. The pitch was based on two short animated films he had made called The Life of Larry and Larry and Steve, a heavyset, good-natured man and his philosophically inclined dog. Those two characters became Peter and Brian Griffin, placed into a larger family, given a fictional New England town called Stoolbend. Wait, no, that came later with the Cleveland show. The Griffin family lived in a fictional Rhode Island town, and around them the whole world of the show was built. The show premiered on the 31st of January 1999, immediately following Super Bowl 33. That is one of the single most valuable time slots in all of television. Roughly 22 million people watched that first episode, because millions of people had their televisions on and were not particularly in a hurry to go anywhere. That first number was partly just geography being placed after the most watched annual television event in the country, but it held enough of those viewers, drew enough genuine interest, that it was clear something was there. That first season averaged around 12.8 million households, which was enough to rank it at number 33 in the Nielsen ratings. For a brand new animated comedy on Fox, those were legitimate numbers. Not astronomical, Not The Simpsons circa 1993, but real and growing and built on something that had actual substance. What made it work from the beginning came down to something that gets discussed surprisingly rarely when people analyze animated comedies. The show had a genuine tonal center. It had a point of view. Every joke came from somewhere, and that somewhere was a particular vision of an American family, specifically a working-class one, led by a man who was not stupid in the way that cartoon dads are often cheaply written as stupid, but who had a kind of cheerful, earnest incomprehension of the world that made him sympathetic even when he was making catastrophically bad decisions. Peter Griffin, in those first 3 seasons, was a man who meant well. That sounds simple. It sounds like the minimum requirement for any lead character, but you would be surprised how many shows fail at that particular minimum. Peter loved Lois. He loved his kids, even if his expression of that love was clumsy and often disastrous. When he did something wrong and he did wrong things constantly, he felt it. He would pause. He would register the consequence. And by the end of the episode, he would usually find his way back to apologizing, or understanding, or at least trying to make it right. That cycle is what created warmth. And warmth is the invisible ingredient that holds comedy together. Without it, jokes are just observations. Without it, characters are just vehicles for gags. The warmth of the early show is what made you care, and caring is what made everything else land. Brian Griffin in those early seasons was the voice of reason in the gentlest possible sense. He was a dog who could talk, drive, drink martinis, and maintained a mostly unsuccessful side career as a literary novelist. He was the one who looked at whatever chaos Peter had generated and responded with a dry, affectionate sort of exasperation. He was the most intellectually present character in a household full of extreme personalities, and his role was essentially to be the person in the room who noticed what was actually happening. He had real flaws, the early Brian. He drank more than he should have. He carried a quiet torch for Lois that he never acted on, but never quite extinguished. He was insecure about his talent as a writer in a way that felt honest and familiar. These were the flaws of a person, not the flaws of a cartoon, and they gave him dimension that made his reasonableness feel earned rather than mechanical. Then there was Stewie. And Stewie in those first 3 seasons was genuinely one of the most original things that had appeared in animated television in a long time. The concept was simple and brilliant. An infant, barely a year old, with the mind and manners and ambitions of a Victorian supervillain. He wanted to kill his mother. He wanted to dominate the planet. He built weapons in his bedroom. He delivered theatrical monologues about world domination while sitting in a high chair being fed pureed carrots. The humor was entirely in the contrast. That tiny baby in the yellow shirt, speaking with a refined British accent about the precise methods by which he intended to enslave all of humanity, while his mother smiled at him and wiped his chin. The joke was inexhaustible in those early seasons because the writers kept finding new angles on it. New machines, new plans, new targets, new explosions of murderous infant ambition. And underneath it all was a dramatic irony that gave every scene with Lois and Stewie together a particular crackle she had no idea. She would pick him up and hug him and call him her sweet baby, and he would look directly into the camera with barely contained homicidal fury. Meg Griffin, in Season 1, was simply a teenage girl, unpopular, not particularly cool. A little awkward in the way that teenage girls in large, chaotic families are often a little awkward. She wanted to belong somewhere. She wanted to be seen. She had a crush on a boy at school. She argued with her parents, the way teenagers argue with parents. None of it was remarkable. That was the point. In a family that included an evil genius baby and a talking literary dog, Meg's normalcy was the joke, the one ordinary thing in an extraordinary household. Chris was the good-natured, slightly soft-headed son. Lois was the capable, patient, quietly long-suffering wife and mother. And together this family lived in a version of suburban American life that was recognizable enough to feel grounded, but exaggerated just enough to give the comedy room to breathe. The humor itself was distinctive from the beginning. Family Guy used cutaway gags, those sudden jumps to unrelated scenes where a character references something and the show cuts away to illustrate it, but in the early seasons these were brief, sharp, and they functioned as punctuation rather than as paragraphs. They were additional jokes on top of an already constructed scene, not replacements for narrative. You could watch an episode from Season 1 and remove every cutaway and still have a complete, coherent story. The cutaways added. They did not carry. What is most striking about going back to watch those early episodes now is how quiet they are in comparison to what the show would become. The humor was often slow building. Characters had real conversations. Episodes had plots that mattered. Things happened that were consequences of previous things. It was, by modern animated sitcom standards, almost classically structured. There was a beginning, a middle, and an end. There was something at stake. And there was, always, that invisible warmth at the center holding everything together. The Parents Television Council targeted the show from nearly the start, labeling it inappropriate for family viewing and filing complaints with the FCC as early as Season 2. And it was worth noting that even in those early, comparatively innocent seasons, the show was genuinely edgy. It made jokes about religion, about sexuality, about death, about American cultural absurdity. It was not a gentle show, but the edge served something. The darkness was in service of comedy that had a point. Even when a joke was offensive, you could usually see what it was trying to say. That would not remain true forever. But it was true then, and understanding that it was true then is what makes the later changes so striking to trace. After a strong first season, Fox began the scheduling decisions that would eventually get the show canceled. The network moved Family Guy repeatedly to Thursday nights where it competed with Frasier, to Tuesday nights where it faced Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The ratings declined not because of quality, but because audiences could not find the show from one week to the next. By the end of Season 3 in 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy. It appeared to be permanent. What happened next is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of television distribution. Cartoon Network bought the rights to air the canceled show's reruns on their Adult Swim block for almost nothing, because nobody thought the show was worth much anymore. The reruns premiered in April 2003, and almost immediately, Family Guy became the highest-rated show on the entire block, boosting Adult Swim's viewership by roughly 239%. At the same time, DVD sets of the first and second seasons sold over 400,000 copies, numbers that for a canceled cartoon were extraordinary. Fox noticed. By 2004, they reversed the cancellation. Season 4 was ordered. The show was coming back. And this is where the story of the offensive content really begins. Because the show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had been canceled in 2002. The gap changed things. The writing staff had scattered. New writers had been hired. The tone had room to shift in ways that nobody fully controlled. And Seth MacFarlane, energized by the revival but also increasingly spread across other projects, was not hovering over every decision the way he had in the original run. The show's relationship with its own mortality, with the question of whether the Griffins actually valued each other, was established early and clearly. In the episode titled Holy Crap from Season 2, Peter's deeply Catholic, deeply judgmental father, Francis Griffin, comes to live with the family. The episode is a study in conflict between Peter's desire for his father's approval and his father's near-total inability to offer it, wrapped in comedy about religious rigidity and the specific texture of Irish Catholic American guilt. But what makes it work, what makes it more than just an extended joke about a stern father figure, is the moment near the end when Francis, softened by an experience that Peter has arranged for him, looks at Peter with something approaching genuine warmth. The comedy of their relationship, played across the episode, has stakes because the characters actually feel things about each other. Even Francis, who seems incapable of warmth, turns out to have a small reservoir of it somewhere. That capacity for warmth, that stubborn resistance to complete emotional emptiness, was the show's defining quality in its early seasons. The darkness was always real. The comedy was always genuinely edgy. But the warmth was never fully absent, and its presence held everything in a context that the audience could inhabit without feeling that the show was simply being cruel. Drop a comment right now letting me know where you are watching from and what time it is there, whether you are in your bed at midnight, or on a couch early in the morning, or somewhere completely different. I genuinely love knowing who is out there. And if you are finding this relaxing, a quiet subscribe costs you nothing and it genuinely keeps this channel going. Section 2. The Golden Era in full. What made Seasons 1 through 3 actually work? Let us spend some proper time in those first 3 seasons. They deserve to be understood on their own terms, rather than just as a before picture in a before and after story. Understanding what specifically was being done right in those seasons, the technical choices, the character decisions, the structural approaches, The comedic philosophy makes it possible to trace the later changes with real precision rather than just as a general observation that things got worse. Because the argument here is not the simple one that Family Guy used to be good and then stopped being good. The argument is more specific than that. The show used to do particular things in particular ways, and those things and ways were what made it work. And those things and ways changed, and the changes are traceable and explicable, not mysterious. Season 2 in particular is where the show found its full identity. The animation, handled largely by Rough Draft Studios, had a lively, expressive quality, a slightly rough-edged energy that gave the characters room to move in ways that felt spontaneous. When Peter fell downstairs, the animation committed to it. When Stewie loaded a laser cannon, the poses were theatrical and deliberate. There was a physicality to the comedy that later, cleaner animation would smooth away. The writing room in those early seasons included people like Chris Sheridan, Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, Matt Weitzman, and Mike Barker. These writers, working closely with McFarlane, established a specific vocabulary for the show. They knew what Peter would and would not do. They knew where Stewie's murderous ambitions came from and how to play them. They knew that Brian's self-deprecating sophistication required a light touch too heavy, and he became pretentious. Too light, and he lost his function as the show's moral compass. The best episodes of this era worked because they combined real character insight with the show's particular brand of absurdist comedy. Take the episode A Picture is Worth a $1,000 from Season 2, where Peter discovers Chris might have artistic talent and tries to send him to art school in New York, spiraling into a story about parental expectations and the gap between wanting the best for your child and understanding what your child actually needs. That sounds earnest because it was. The comedy came from the execution, the characters behaved in ridiculous ways, but the emotional center was genuine. Or consider Death is a Bitch from Season 2, where Death himself shows up and twists his ankle, leaving Peter as a temporary substitute. The comedy of Peter being forced to reluctantly bring death to various people while Death recovers on his couch was genuinely funny, but the episode also found room for a touching moment near the end, where Peter grapples briefly with his own mortality. That moment was not extended or maudlin. It was just there, and then gone, like a single note struck cleanly before the song moved on. The treatment of sensitive topics in those early seasons was notably different from what would come later. The show made jokes about race, about disability, about religion, about sexuality, but those jokes tended to have a structural awareness they were making a point about something, even if the point was small or simple. The episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, originally produced for Season 3 but held back and aired later due to content concerns, is a good example of the show's early approach. Peter, after losing the family's money, becomes convinced that what he needs is Jewish financial acumen, and starts looking for a Jewish man to befriend. The episode played with stereotypes aggressively, but it also understood those stereotypes as stereotypes. Peter's ignorance was the joke, not the Jewish people themselves. Max Weinstein, the Jewish accountant Peter befriends, was a fully realized human being who was competent and kind and had an actual personality beyond being a vehicle for the episode's central premise. Fox held the episode back because the content was considered too risky. McFarlane disagreed with that decision. The episode eventually aired on Adult Swim in November 2003 during the rerun period that drove the show's revival, and it was well received as a piece of satire that was sharp even when it was uncomfortable. What this episode demonstrates is that the early show had a functional satirical logic. Even when it was offensive, and it was sometimes quite offensive, it was offensive in service of something. The offense was the delivery mechanism for a point about human folly, cultural assumptions, or the gap between what people think and what they say. The early Quagmire is also worth examining in this context, because his character trajectory is one of the more telling case studies in how the show's relationship with offensive content changed over time. In Season 1, Glenn Quagmire was a hypersexual neighbor who made innuendo-laden comments and had a clear, almost cartoonish single-mindedness about pursuing women. His catchphrase, the elongated, appreciative sound he made at the sight of an attractive woman, was recognizable enough to become widely known. He was an exaggeration of a particular kind of 1970s bachelor archetype, playing with cultural nostalgia in a way that was knowing rather than celebratory. The show was not saying Quagmire's attitude was admirable. It was saying, this kind of person exists, and here he is as a character. For a while, That was enough of a framing to give the character a certain comedic coherence. He was absurd precisely because his one-track mind was so extreme as to be obviously satirical. But we will get into what happened to Quagmire as the seasons progressed. For now, the point is that in these early years, even the most extreme character on the show had a satirical logic behind him. The family dynamics in seasons 1 through 3 were also genuinely warm in ways that would gradually erode. The Griffins fought. They miscommunicated. They made mistakes that rippled out in ways they had not anticipated. But they came back together. Episodes ended with reconciliations that felt earned because the episodes had actually taken the time to build the conflict that required reconciliation. In one of the most memorable early episodes, Peter accidentally lets slip that Meg is adopted. The fallout of that lie ripples through the family for the entire episode. Meg goes through real emotional confusion. Lois is furious with Peter. Peter tries to fix things in his characteristically ham-fisted way. And at the end, the family resolves the situation with genuine feeling, not through a single magic line of dialogue, but through a sequence of small moments that collectively added up to something meaningful. The episode was funny. It was also genuinely touching. It held both at once without either one undermining the other. That balance, comedy and heart held in tension, is the thing that made Family Guy great in its early years. And it is the thing that the show slowly, systematically, and almost unconsciously lost as the seasons accumulated. One thing that gets overlooked in discussions of the show's early quality is how good the pacing was. Comedy on television lives and dies by timing, not just the timing of individual jokes, but the timing of scenes, the tempo of an episode, the rhythm that tells the audience when to expect a laugh and when to be surprised. The early Family Guy had genuinely exceptional pacing. Episodes moved quickly without feeling rushed. Scenes ended before they wore out their welcome. Characters delivered lines and then the camera moved. There was a brisk energy that felt alive. This kind of pacing is harder to achieve than it appears. It requires writers and editors who share an instinct about when enough is enough, about when a joke has landed and it is time to move on, rather than underlining the joke by continuing past it. The early writing room had that instinct. You can feel it in any Season 1 episode. The show trusts its jokes, trusts the audience to have caught them, and moves forward. There is a confidence in that trust that the later seasons lost. The later seasons did not trust their jokes. They stretched them past the landing point, held them there, and waited for a reaction that often did not come because the joke had already passed its moment. The early show also had a relationship with silence that later seasons abandoned. Not literal silence, but the comedic space between things. The moment after a punchline where the show let the joke exist before covering it with the next thing. That space is where the audience gets to fully receive the joke, to laugh without talking over their own laughter. When the later show started filling every moment with content, it closed down that space, and the audience experience became denser but somehow less satisfying. The individual characters in the first 3 seasons also had a quality that the later seasons frequently failed to maintain. They were consistent with themselves. Not static, they changed within episodes, reacted to events, grew or failed to grow in ways that felt real. But their core personalities were stable enough that you could predict, in a broad way, how they would respond to a given situation. Peter would make the worst possible decision from a position of confident ignorance. Brian would see the problem clearly and articulate it with dry precision. Stewie would find a way to make any situation about his own plans for global domination. Lois would be the one holding things together. These were reliable enough to be the foundation for comedy, because comedy requires the audience to have expectations, so those expectations can be subverted. When characters become unpredictable, not in the good comedic sense, not because they are surprising you in ways that illuminate their character, but simply because the writing does not maintain a consistent sense of who they are, the foundation for comedy is gone. You cannot subvert an expectation you have not established. The later seasons often gave audiences characters who did things simply because the episode needed them to, not because the characters would actually do those things, and that inconsistency was one of the more corrosive forces in the show's long decline. Stewie's evolution, even within these early seasons, is worth tracing, because it shows that the writers were always looking for new angles. By season 2, they were already adding softness to his villainy in small doses, moments where his anger cracked and something more vulnerable showed through. These were treated as comic reveals, small glimpses behind the evil baby exterior. They were funny precisely because they were brief and then quickly suppressed, Stewie snapping back into his theatrical menace as if nothing had happened. The vulnerability was a joke. It was not yet a character direction. Brian's relationship with Peter was the show's emotional engine, in a way that often gets overlooked in favor of the more celebrated Brian and Stewie pairing of later seasons. Peter and Brian were genuinely funny together because they were so different in such specific, complementary ways. Peter's complete lack of self-awareness was constantly refracted through Brian's deeply self-aware exasperation. They made each other's qualities funnier by contrast. Brian seemed more sophisticated beside Peter. Peter seemed more haplessly lovable beside Brian. Neither one worked as well without the other. Season 3, the last before the cancellation, maintained the show's quality while beginning to show very early signs of what would change. The cutaway gags were growing slightly in frequency. The humor was occasionally reaching for a louder, more extreme note than the earlier episodes had favored. Nothing alarming. Nothing that seemed like the beginning of something larger. Just small adjustments, barely perceptible from episode to episode, that in retrospect were the first faint indicators of a direction. The cancellation, paradoxically, preserved the memory of these seasons as a golden era more effectively than continued production would have. The 3-year gap gave those early episodes a kind of mythological distance. When the show came back in 2005, people were not just excited for more Family Guy, they were experiencing something like the return of something lost, and that emotional context made any change in tone or character feel more pronounced than it might have if the show had simply continued without interruption. Section 3. The Revival and the First Real Shift. Seasons 4 and 5. Season 4 premiered on the 1st of May 2005, and the hype surrounding its return was significant. Fox placed it in the center of their Sunday animation domination lineup, alongside The Simpsons and the newly launched American Dad. The audience was ready. People showed up in large numbers. Season 4 averaged around 7.9 million viewers, which for a show that had been canceled for 3 years was a remarkable achievement. But if you go back and watch the first few episodes of Season 4 carefully, something is already slightly different. The difference is not catastrophic, it is not immediately alarming, but it is there if you know what to listen for. The world of 2005 was not the world of 1999. The internet had changed substantially. The culture of sharing media had emerged and was already accelerating. The relationship between a television show and its audience was no longer contained within the television set. It extended into online communities, clip sharing, fan forums, early social media. How a show was discussed online was beginning to matter in ways it had not mattered when Family Guy originally aired. And Family Guy, with its cutaway-based format and its gift for generating brief, self-contained comedic moments, was particularly well-positioned to benefit from this new distribution reality. Also particularly well-positioned to be shaped by it in ways that would compound over time. The animation had changed. Rough Draft Studios, which had given seasons 2 and 3 their particular lively energy, was not the primary studio for the revival. The new animation was cleaner in some technical respects, but stiffer in its movement. Characters moved more carefully, less spontaneously. There was a precision to the new animation that paradoxically made it feel less alive. Comedy and animation lives and dies in the physics of movement, in the snap of a reaction, the exaggeration of an expression, the weight of a falling character. The early animation had those things. The new animation had polish, where the old animation had energy. More significant than the animation change was what had happened to the writing room. When a show is canceled, the writers do what writers do. They find other work. They take positions on other shows. They move on. You cannot reasonably expect a team of people to sit idle for 3 years, waiting for a show that may never return. When Family Guy was revived, many of the original writers were no longer available or had commitments elsewhere. New writers came in. And while new writers are not automatically a problem, they bring different sensibilities, different instincts about where the comedy lives, and how dark is dark enough and what the characters would actually do. MacFarlane acknowledged this directly in interviews, noting that the constant cancellations and revivals meant the show was always having to restaff. Every time the writing room scattered and reconstituted, something small was lost: a piece of institutional knowledge about the show's tonal center, an instinct about when to pull back, a shared understanding of who these characters actually were. In Season 4, the cutaway gags began to change in character. They got longer. They got more frequent. Instead of being the quick, sharp punctuation of the early seasons, they started to expand into fuller scenes. A cutaway that would have lasted 15 seconds in Season 2 might now run for 45. This was partly driven by the internet. YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy returned, and almost immediately fans were clipping cutaway gags and uploading them as standalone videos. A 30-second Family Guy bit was perfect for the emerging clip culture of early YouTube. Millions of views poured in from people who had watched a single cutaway without any context. The show's production was not blind to this. The cutaway gag, already a signature of the show's style, was becoming the most commercially successful element of the show in a way that was entirely new. Clips went viral, cutaways got shared. The metric of success was shifting from episode quality to moment quality, and that shift had consequences for how episodes were constructed. Peter's character in Season 4 was still recognizable as the Peter of the early seasons, but small changes were appearing. His stupidity occasionally dropped below the floor that the early seasons had maintained. In those original episodes, Peter was dim in a way that felt grounded in a particular kind of cheerful, confident incomprehension. He did not understand things, but he did not know he did not understand them, and that combination produced a kind of comic dignity. In Season 4, moments appeared where his incomprehension went further than that, where he did things that required not just stupidity but a kind of moral vacancy that the early Peter would not have possessed. These were small moments. They passed quickly, but they were there. Brian's political dimension, which had always been a part of who he was but which the early show kept as one ingredient among many, began to take up more space. Episodes started giving Brian speeches, actual, structured speeches about political and social issues. Where the early Brian might have made a dry observation about something and moved on, the later Brian increasingly stopped scenes to deliver a perspective that felt less like character dialogue and more like a position paper read aloud by a talking dog. Even viewers who agreed with the positions found it slightly uncomfortable because the naturalness of the character was being replaced by function. Brian was becoming a vehicle for a viewpoint rather than a person who happened to have viewpoints. Stewie's transformation was more obvious and more deliberate. The creative decision to move away from the evil genius baby character, a decision MacFarlane and the writing staff made consciously, fundamentally altered the show's most original creation. The evil baby who built laser guns and plotted Lois's demise was being quietly retired. In his place came a Stewie who was more emotional, more relationship-focused, more interested in his connection with Brian than in world domination. To be fair, the Brian and Stewie dynamic that emerged from this choice produced some of the show's most entertaining episodes. Their odd couple energy, Stewie's manic, theatrical intensity bouncing off Brian's weary sophistication, worked beautifully in the Road to Adventure episodes. Road to Europe, Road to Rupert, Road to the North Pole, these episodes gave the two characters space to build something that felt genuinely playful and affectionate. But what was being traded away was irreplaceable. There was nothing else on television like Evil Stewie. That character was entirely original, with a comedic premise that had essentially infinite directions to go. New schemes, new machines, new targets beyond Lois, new alliances, new enemies. The writers decided they had exhausted the concept. But looking back across the show's subsequent decades, that decision reads less like reaching a natural ending point and more like abandoning a vein of gold because the mining was getting harder. Season 5, running from 2006 into 2007, produced some episodes that fans still consider among the best the show has made. Barely Legal, where Meg develops a crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of pity, was sharp, funny, and showed that the show could still construct a character-centered comedy when it committed to one. The episode Road to Rupert was another high point. These were episodes that proved the talent was still there and still functioning. But the context in which those episodes existed was changing. The writing room had a different composition from the original seasons. The relationship between MacFarlane and the room was different. He was now simultaneously running American Dad, developing other projects, doing press for an increasingly prominent public profile. The intensive, direct oversight that characterized his involvement in the original seasons was being stretched across more obligations. This is worth understanding clearly because it is not a story about MacFarlane abandoning the show or ceasing to care. It is a story about the natural consequences of success. When a creator builds something that becomes commercially significant, the success generates opportunities and obligations that pull the creator away from the day-to-day work that made the thing good in the first place. McFarlane was not choosing other things over Family Guy because Family Guy did not matter to him. He was navigating the reality of being one of the most sought-after creators in television, with a portfolio that was growing rapidly and with creative interests that extended well beyond the Griffin family. But the show felt the difference. The writing room, more autonomous now, began making choices that reflected the instincts of the assembled writers, rather than the instincts of the singular vision that had originally designed the show. This is not necessarily a path to decline. Many shows improve when their creators step back and allow a room full of talented writers to develop the material. But those shows typically have a culture and a set of habits that maintain the original vision even in the creator's reduced presence. Family Guy's culture in the revival period was still finding its footing, and without the original creator's hand on the wheel, the cultural norms of what was acceptable and what was too far had more room to shift. But Season 5 also significantly escalated the treatment of Meg Griffin. In the first 3 seasons, being the least interesting person in an interesting family was the joke about Meg. By Season 5, the joke had darkened. Comments about her physical appearance became more frequent. The family's dismissal of her sharpened into something that no longer felt like benign neglect and started to feel like active contempt. Peter made crueler comments. The other characters joined in more readily. The shift from Meg being boring to Meg being a target had begun, and once it began, it only moved in one direction. The family dynamics in Season 5 were also cooling. The warmth that had been so central to the early show, that sense that underneath all the chaos these people loved each other, was becoming less consistent. Episodes no longer reliably ended with reconciliation. Peter and Lois fought in ways that did not always resolve. The family spent more time being at each other rather than with each other. None of this was dramatic enough to feel like a crisis. It was just a gradual cooling, like the temperature in a room on a slowly darkening afternoon. Section 4. Humor as a weapon. The show's relationship with shock value. There is a real and important distinction between dark humor and shock value, and understanding that distinction is central to understanding what happened to Family Guy over its run. The distinction is not about what topics the comedy engages with. Dark humor and shock value can both engage with death, violence, sexuality, race, religion, disability, or any other topic that makes people uncomfortable. The distinction is about what the comedy is doing with those topics, whether it is illuminating something or simply displaying it, whether it is saying something or just pointing. The writer Mel Brooks, who built a career in comedy that regularly ventured into genuinely dark territory, articulated something important about this when he discussed his approach to comedy about the Holocaust and about Nazism. His argument was that comedy could strip away some of the mystique and terror from evil, that laughter could be a form of defiance, a refusal to be entirely controlled by the thing being laughed at. This is a genuine insight about what dark comedy can do at its best. The 2,000-year-old man's casual dismissiveness about great historical catastrophes, Blazing Saddles' gleeful satirical destruction of Western mythology and American racism, the producer's theatrical excess. These works used the humor as a way of engaging with darkness that had real thought and real purpose behind it. The best early Family Guy episodes had this quality, however different the scale and ambition. When Peter's stupidity led him into genuinely dark situations, the comedy was doing something, showing something about human nature, American culture, the specific texture of working-class male experience, the gaps between desire and reality that define most lives. The darkness was in service of observation. There is a real and important distinction between dark humor and shock value, and understanding that distinction is central to understanding what happened to Family Guy over its run. Dark humor takes something uncomfortable, death, disease, failure, cruelty, the indifference of the universe to human suffering, and finds within it something absurd, something that makes the discomfort manageable through laughter. Good dark humor is an act of emotional alchemy. It does not deny the darkness. It transforms it. It says, yes, this terrible thing is real, and here, in this specific comedic framing, is a way to hold it that does not break you. Shock value is different. Shock value takes something uncomfortable and puts it in front of you without transformation. It presents the dark thing directly and waits for the reaction. The goal is not comedic alchemy, but a simple response, usually a gasp, a wince, a nervous laugh that is more about release than genuine amusement. Shock value does not say anything about the dark thing. It just shows it to you and dares you to keep watching. In its best moments, and it had many best moments, especially in those early seasons, Family Guy was genuinely practicing dark humor. When Stewie fantasized about murdering Lois in elaborate, theatrical ways, the darkness was real, but it was also obviously joyfully absurd. The contrast between the reality of what was being described and the comic formality with which Stewie described it was the alchemy. You were not supposed to think about violence against mothers. You were supposed to marvel at the sheer strangeness of an infant in formal diction laying out a weapons diagram. But as the seasons progressed, the balance shifted. The show began to reach for darkness, not to transform it, but simply to present it. And the consequences of that shift were visible and measurable in the content that started appearing from around season 7 onward. The physical violence in the show changed character. In the early seasons, cartoon violence followed the laws of cartoon physics, exaggerated, elastic, consequence-free in the way that animation has always been consequence-free as a genre. Characters fell. Characters got hit by things. Characters bounced back. Nobody questioned it because no one expected cartoon violence to track real physics. That was the deal. But starting in the later seasons, the violence became more realistic in its detail and less exaggerated in its presentation. Injuries were depicted with a clinical specificity that felt designed not to generate laughter, but to generate discomfort. Characters were shown with wounds that were described in terms that went beyond cartoon shorthand. The show started using graphic physical suffering extended, detailed, lingering in ways that had no comedic payoff beyond the extremeness itself. Peter's interaction with his own children escalated in ways that the writers seemed to present as edgy comedy, but which grew progressively harder to laugh at. He would physically harm Meg in ways that, played out in live action, would be unambiguously domestic violence. He would steal from Stewie his own infant and face no consequence. The physical cruelty toward his own family moved from exaggerated cartoon roughhousing into something that had the texture and the structure of actual abuse. There is a moment in a later season where Peter, seeing a fin in the water while he and Lois are on a boat, shoves his wife underneath the water and flees in the boat, leaving her to what he believes is a shark attack. He abandons her. He saves himself. The show plays this as comedy. The early Peter could not have done this, not because the early Peter was morally perfect, but because the early Peter loved Lois. Whatever else was true about him, his love for his wife was real and consistent and visible. The later Peter is a character who has been so thoroughly stripped of emotional interiority that abandoning his wife to a perceived shark becomes just another gag. The sexual content of the show also escalated in ways that were more troubling in their implications than their explicitness. Quagmire, in the early seasons, was a comedic exaggeration of male hypersexuality, the kind of cartoon Lothario who existed in dozens of 1970s sitcoms, but who was played here with enough self-awareness to function as a mild satire. His behavior was absurd. The absurdity was the joke. As the seasons progressed, the show began to expand the scope of what Quagmire was depicted as doing, and the framing shifted in a way that made the satire harder to locate. In an episode from Season 8 titled Quagmire's Dad, the show introduced Quagmire's father as a transgender woman, a storyline that was written by a writer who had a personal connection to the experience. The intent was not purely hostile. McFarlane defended the episode by noting its personal origins for the writer involved. But Brian's reaction to discovering he had slept with Quagmire's father without knowing she was transgender extended sequences of vomiting, expressions of profound revulsion was held up for comedy in a way that many viewers found transphobic, regardless of the episode's underlying intent. This is a recurring pattern in the show's relationship with offensive content. The stated intent and the executed content diverge in ways that matter. The show sometimes claimed satirical purpose for material that, in execution, functioned primarily to amplify the revulsion it was supposedly critiquing. When a joke about a marginalized group is built around the disgust reaction of the character observing that group, and that disgust reaction is the comedic payload, then regardless of framing, what the audience receives is a model of disgust as the appropriate response. The episode Turban Cowboy from Season 11 is perhaps the clearest and most discussed example of the show's relationship with shock value reaching a point of genuine consequence. The episode featured Peter befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud, who was eventually revealed to be part of a terrorist cell. The episode contained a cutaway gag depicting Peter driving a car through the Boston Marathon crowd. That cutaway aired on the 17th of March 2013. The Boston Marathon bombing occurred on the 15th of April, 2013, less than a month later. Fox pulled the episode from streaming platforms in the aftermath of the bombing, and it remained unavailable for an extended period. The cutaway had nothing satirically interesting to say. It depicted mass violence at a famous public event as a brief visual joke. There was no comment embedded in it. There was no angle on American violence culture, or on the relationship between comedy and atrocity, or on anything that would give it any dimension beyond its own extremeness. It was shock value without a destination. And when reality made a brutal intersection with the joke, the lack of any deeper content left the show with nothing to stand behind. Season 11's approach to its Muslim characters was widely criticized along a separate axis from the marathon cutaway. The episode structured its story around the stereotype of the Muslim terrorist, paid brief lip service to the idea that not all Muslims are terrorists through a single line by Joe Swanson, and then undermined that gesture entirely by making the stereotype the literal resolution of the plot. Mahmoud was in fact a terrorist. The nominal counter-message was decorative. The actual message of the episode, what the story insisted upon with its plot, was the stereotype. This is the difference between satire and endorsement that the show increasingly blurred. Satire requires a critical relationship with its subject matter. When Peter Griffin holds a dumb belief, satire examines that dumb belief, shows its consequences, and positions it as a dumb belief. When a story's structure validates the stereotype being nominally criticized, it is no longer operating as satire. It is using the language of satire to deliver content that functions as the opposite. The academic literature on Family Guy's relationship with race and satirical intent is interesting in this regard. A study examining the show's racial politics noted that it often gestures toward critique while collapsing the distinctions that critique requires. The humor in episodes dealing with race frequently relies on exaggerated stereotypes, exaggerated black fathers, hypersexualized youth, aggressive law enforcement for its comedy. The stereotypes generate the laugh. The nominal frame of satire around them does not change what the audience actually receives, which is the stereotype as comedic material. The show was aware of this tension at some level. Characters occasionally broke the fourth wall to reference the show's own controversial content, sometimes acknowledging directly that a joke might be too far. These moments of self-awareness were positioned as a kind of preemptive defense if the show named its own offensiveness. It could not be criticized for failing to see it. But acknowledging that something might be offensive is not the same as making it not offensive. A show that says this might be too much and then does the thing anyway has not protected itself through the acknowledgement. It has just added a layer of knowing performance to the thing. Seth MacFarlane himself has given somewhat contradictory accounts of the show's relationship with its more offensive content over the years. In a 2012 interview with Entertainment Weekly, he admitted that there had been jokes he wished the show had not made. In interviews around the show's 25th anniversary in 2024, he spoke about the importance of context, that the jokes are told from the perspective of flawed characters, and that audiences understand that Peter Griffin's worldview is not an endorsement. He described a guiding question the writing room allegedly applied to questionable content. Could we defend this? That question is more useful as a framework than it might initially appear. The problem is that the application of the question clearly shifted over the seasons. In the early years, the answer to, "Could we defend this?" was grounded in whether the joke actually said something, whether the offense was in service of a point. In the later years, the defense sometimes collapsed into, "We can defend this because we are animated characters, and animated characters get more latitude than live-action ones." That is technically true as a sociological observation about audience reception, but it is not a creative defense. It is a structural loophole. The show's producer Rich Appel made exactly this argument in a 2022 Hollywood Reporter interview, noting that animation gives the show cover that live-action equivalents would not have. People respond differently to animated characters saying offensive things than to real people saying the same things. That is true. The question is whether "we can get away with it" is the same thing as "we should do it." And the late seasons of Family Guy sometimes collapsed those two questions into each other in ways that produced the most troubling content in the show's history. Section 5. The Meg Griffin Problem When Comedy Becomes Something Else. Of all the things that changed in Family Guy over its run, the treatment of Meg Griffin is the one that most clearly marks the distance between what the show was and what it became. Because what happened to Meg was not just a character choice, it was an inadvertent reveal of something about how the show's writers understood comedy, cruelty, and the relationship between the two. The story of Meg Griffin across Family Guy's run is, in some respects, the story of what happens when a show decides that a particular character's suffering is an inexhaustible comedic resource, and then mines that resource without asking whether the resource has a floor, without asking how deep the hole goes before it stops being a comedy and becomes something that says things about the show's values that the show might not intend. Let us be specific about the mechanics of how this happened, because the how matters as much as the what. In the early seasons, the comedy of Meg Griffin was built on a structural insight that was actually quite clever. In a family this extreme, a father who is a walking natural disaster, a mother who somehow maintains functional competence amid constant chaos, an infant who is actively building a time machine in his crib, a dog who has read everything you have ever heard of, and several things you have not, the most ordinary member of the household carries a specific kind of comedy. Meg's particular tragedy in those first seasons was not that she was unloved, it was that she was unremarkable. She was the one person in the Griffin house who had not been granted any unusual characteristic. No genius, no villainy, no exotic capability, just a normal teenage girl, trying to be seen in a house where everything else was louder than she was. That is a comedic situation with genuine resonance. The ordinary person surrounded by the extraordinary, fighting to be noticed without anything extraordinary to deploy this, is a rich comic premise because it reflects a real human experience. Most of us are, at some level, Meg. Most of us are trying to be seen in environments that have more dramatic priorities than we do. The comedy of Meg Griffin in Season 1 was the comedy of recognition, and it was good. What happened next was that the writers discovered something different worked even better with certain audiences. Meg's suffering. Not just her invisibility, but her active mistreatment. The shift from being overlooked to being targeted is a significant one, and it happened gradually enough that no single episode was obviously the moment of no return. But the direction of travel was consistent, and by the middle seasons it had carried Meg Griffin very far from where she started. There is a concept in literary criticism about what is sometimes called the implied author, the sensibility that appears to be behind the choices a work makes, the values and perspectives and judgments that can be inferred from the work's own decisions. The implied author is not the same as the actual author or the writing team. It is the figure who seems to have made the choices that appear on the page or on the screen. By examining what an implied author consistently chooses which characters are treated with dignity, which are not, which behaviors are rewarded, which are punished, which suffering is presented as serious, and which as comedic, you can develop a picture of what values the work actually embodies, as opposed to what the people who made it intended. The implied author of Family Guy in its middle and later seasons made some choices about Meg Griffin that are worth examining through this lens. The implied author consistently chose to present Meg's suffering as primarily comedic. The implied author consistently chose to reset any episode that gave her dignity, returning her to the degraded position in subsequent weeks. The implied author chose in Seahorse Seashell Party to have the victim of sustained abuse accept her victimhood as a form of service to others. These choices, made consistently across hundreds of episodes, constitute a position, not a stated one, not an intended one, but a demonstrated one. It is worth being precise about what the character was at the start, because the precision makes what she became so much starker. Meg Griffin in Season 1 was not a comedic character in the traditional sense. She was not funny in herself. She did not generate comedy through her personality or her behavior in the way that Peter or Stewie did. Her comedy was structural, the comedy of the ordinary in the extraordinary, the comedy of the most human character in a household of exaggerations. She existed as a calibration point. Her normalcy made everything else's abnormality visible as abnormality. This is a real comedic function. And when it is honored, when the ordinary character is treated as a person whose ordinariness has value, it produces a warmth that the comedy can draw from. The ordinary character grounds the extraordinary characters in a way that makes the extraordinary characters more human and therefore funnier. Meg's presence in the early show was an anchor. She was the character who reminded you that underneath all the chaos was a real family with real people in it. Meg was voiced, from Season 2 onward, by Mila Kunis, who has been consistently excellent in the role regardless of what the material asked her to do. In Season 1, she was voiced by Lacey Chabert. The character herself did not change dramatically between the two actresses. She was a teenager, she was struggling with the social dynamics of high school, she was the least remarkable member of an unremarkable family in a town full of strange people. The joke about Meg in those first 3 seasons was essentially structural. You had a family that included a baby supervillain, a talking intellectual dog, a man who got into genuinely surreal situations with alarming regularity, and a woman who held all of it together with a kind of beleaguered grace. And then you had Meg, a regular teenage girl. In that context, her normalcy was comedy. She was the one real thing. Her desire to be popular was something millions of teenage girls could recognize. Her frustration with her family was entirely relatable. The show used her relative ordinariness as a counterpoint to everyone else's extremeness, and that counterpoint had comedic value precisely because it was genuine. The shift began in season 4. The timing aligns with the revival, the new writing staff, the new sensibilities, the different instincts about where the comedy lived. Jokes about Meg's physical appearance began appearing with increasing frequency. Characters started making comments about her being unattractive. The reaction shots when Meg entered a room started including expressions of revulsion. The comedy was no longer about Meg being the ordinary one in an extraordinary family. It was becoming about Meg being someone who deserved contempt because of how she looked. This is a meaningful shift in the ethical structure of the joke. Jokes about a character being the boring one in an exciting family can work comedically because the target is not the person but the dynamic. The comedy is in the contrast. Jokes about a character being physically ugly shift the target to an unchosen physical characteristic that the character has no ability to change. The comedy, if it is comedy, is directed entirely at the person's body. And when that becomes the dominant and recurring joke about a character, the show is saying something about that character, and the audience is being invited to agree with what the show is saying. By seasons 8 through 14, Meg's treatment had escalated so dramatically that it had moved from the category of recurring joke into something that functioned structurally more like ritual humiliation. Peter physically harmed her in ways that were framed as comedy. The entire Griffin family participated. The school she attended was uniformly hostile. Strangers on the street were contemptuous. The town existed in apparent consensus that Meg Griffin's suffering was acceptable and deserved. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party from season 10 is the one most often cited as the point where the show revealed the most about what it thought it was doing with Meg. Trapped in the house during a hurricane, Meg finally confronts her family with everything they have done to her. It is a genuinely affecting sequence. She is specific and accurate, and everything she says is verifiable. All of the things she accuses each family member of are things the show has actually depicted. The show has built, over years, exactly the case she is now making. And then comes the resolution. After Meg's confrontation, the family falls apart without a shared target. They turn on each other. Without Meg absorbing the hostility has nowhere to go and the family cannot function. So Meg, in conversation with Brian, voluntarily withdraws her accusations. She accepts her role as the family's designated target because, as the episode frames it, without her performing that function, the family collapses. She agrees to go back to being hurt so that everyone else can be okay. The message embedded in that ending is worth sitting with for a moment because it is not a casual message. It tells the audience that victims of sustained cruelty have a responsibility to continue absorbing that cruelty for the sake of the people perpetrating it. It says that standing up for yourself when you are the person who has been made the target is a kind of selfishness because your suffering is doing important structural work for the people who are hurting you. It says the correct ending is not justice or change but acceptance and return. Whether the writers intended this message is a genuinely open question. It is possible they were trying to make a darkly comedic point about family dysfunction, about how abusive dynamics perpetuate themselves because they serve some function for the abusers. That reading is possible. But even if that was the intent, the execution placed the responsibility for resolution entirely on Meg. She was the one who backed down. She was the one who accepted the situation. And that choice to have the victim be the one to restore equilibrium communicated something particular, regardless of intent. What was especially frustrating to many long-term viewers was that the show demonstrated, in scattered episodes across the later seasons, that it knew how to write Meg as a real character with dimension. The Simpsons crossover episode from season 13 featured a subplot where Meg meets Lisa Simpson, who encourages her and helps her discover a talent for the saxophone. It was warm, well-written, and showed what Meg could be when treated as a person rather than a punchline. The season 14 episode Peter's Sister offered a genuine dramatic explanation for why Peter treated Meg the way he did. connecting his behavior to his own childhood experience of abuse, and gave the two characters a real, emotionally resonant reconciliation. And then the next episode would reset everything. Meg would be right back at the bottom. Peter would be right back to treating her with contempt. The reconciliation had happened, and then it had not happened, because the show needed Meg in the position she was in for the recurring joke to keep working. This pattern, the meaningful moment followed by the immediate reset, was one of the most damaging habits in the later seasons across multiple characters and storylines. But it was most visible and most consequential with Meg. The show was capable of treating her as a full character. It chose reliably not to. And that choice, multiplied across hundreds of episodes across more than a decade, created a situation where the show had essentially communicated its conviction through sheer repetition that some people are simply deserving of contempt for no defensible reason. It is worth noting that this changed somewhat around season 14 and 15, and the change has been credited at least partly to the addition of more women to the writing staff. As the writer's room became more gender diverse, the Meg material shifted. The extreme physical abuse decreased. She started getting episodes where she was competent or tough or even genuinely cool. By the later seasons, she had graduated from punching bag to something more like a secondary character with occasional dignity. But the damage of those middle seasons was real and lasting, and anyone who has watched the show across its full run carries the weight of those episodes. Mila Kunis has spoken publicly about the strange experience of being associated with a character whose primary on-screen experience is being told to shut up and go away. She described instances where people would repeat the famous dismissive line directed at Meg, the one Peter uses to shut her down and send her from the room to Kunis herself at public events. The fictional cruelty had become a social currency in the real world, something people used to signal their familiarity with the show. That fact is worth pausing on. When a show's most recognizable contribution to popular culture is a phrase used to dismiss a young woman, it is worth asking what the show taught people about the value of that woman's voice. Section 6. Peter Griffin and the Death of Consequence. The transformation of Peter Griffin across the show's run is one of the most carefully documented declines in animated television history, precisely because so many fans were watching it happen in real time and could describe exactly what they were losing as they lost it. The name for this kind of character, degradation, Flanderization, borrowed from the Simpsons character Ned Flanders, whose own reduction from multi-dimensional neighbor to one-dimensional religious caricature gave the concept its vocabulary does not fully capture what happened to Peter, because what happened to Peter was more severe and more structurally damaging than most examples of the phenomenon. Ned Flanders becoming more purely religious over time is a specific and manageable form of Flanderization. One trait expands and the others contract. The character becomes thinner, but Ned Flanders did not become cruel. He did not become a danger to the people around him. He became a less interesting version of a fundamentally decent person. Peter Griffin became a less decent version of a fundamentally comic character. And that is a different and more serious change, because the comedy of the early Peter Griffin depended specifically on his decency. The stupidity was funny because underneath it was a genuine warmth. You laughed at Peter because you also liked him, and you liked him because you could tell that he meant well, even when his attempts to do well produced spectacular, physics-defying disaster. Remove the warmth, and what you have left is not a funny character. You have a selfish, impulsive, sometimes violent man whose actions harm the people around him, presented in an animated format that makes those actions look like cartoon comedy, but cannot fully insulate the audience from the reality of what they are watching. Peter in the later seasons was someone you would not want to know. He was someone who, if you encountered him in an actual social context, would leave you exhausted and unhappy. And spending 22 minutes with someone like that, in the company of his family who has to live with him, is not a comfortable experience even when the format insists it should be comedic. The specific mechanism of his transformation is worth describing in detail, because it unfolded in a particular way that reveals something about how Flanderization works in practice. Peter did not simply become meaner all at once. He became meaner through a process of incremental permission granting. Each season, a few episodes pushed his behavior slightly past the place where it had previously been. Each episode that pushed him past the previous limit normalized the new position. The audience absorbed the new version, the writers acknowledged that the new version had been accepted, and the next season's writers began with the newly established floor. What this means practically is that no individual episode in the middle seasons is necessarily the one that broke the character. There is no single episode you can point to and say, here is where Peter Griffin stopped being someone you could root for. The transformation was too gradual for that. The individual steps were small enough that each one seemed like a manageable extension of the previous one. Only when you get to a season 10 or 11 episode and compare it directly to a season 2 episode does the full distance become visible. This is why time travel within a long-running series, the experience of jumping from an early episode to a much later one without the intervening journey, is so clarifying. It removes the gradual acclimatization that makes the changes feel continuous and normal, and makes the before and after gap starkly visible. Season 2 Peter and Season 12 Peter are not the same character. They share a design and a voice and a name, but the interior of the character, the moral logic that governs his behavior, is fundamentally different. One of them is a man who means well and fails in specific, comedically productive ways. The other is a man who does not appear to mean anything in particular, who exists to generate comedic situations through behavior that is either too extreme to be funny or too cruel to be comfortable. The relationship between Peter's transformation and the show's broader shift toward offensive content is direct and causative. Peter is the show's center of gravity. When the center becomes cruel and consequence-free, the show's moral universe reorganizes around that cruelty. What is acceptable at the center determines what is acceptable at the edges. A Peter Griffin who abandons his wife to a shark establishes a context in which almost anything can happen without the audience expecting justice or consequence. And a show where nothing has consequences is a show where the content escalates without limit, because the limit is usually set by consequence. The transformation of Peter Griffin is the central dramatic story of Family Guy's decline, and it is a story about what happens when a character's defining quality, his lovability, is stripped away so gradually that nobody quite notices it going until it is already gone. Peter Griffin, as a comedic archetype, was drawing from a long tradition of the well-meaning bumbler, the man whose heart is good, but whose execution is catastrophically wrong. This archetype has a long and successful history in comedy precisely because it allows an audience to laugh at consequences without losing sympathy for the person experiencing them. You are not laughing at a bad person. You are laughing at the gap between good intentions and terrible execution, which is a gap most people recognize from their own lives. The great bumbling characters of comedy, think of the tradition that runs from Stan Laurel through Basil Fawlty through Homer Simpson in his best seasons, all share this quality. They mean well. The meaning well is not a decoration on the character. It is structural. It is the thing that keeps the audience's sympathy intact through all the disasters. Without it, the disasters are not funny. They are just disasters, and you are watching someone be hurt by them. And the question of whether to laugh depends on whether you can find something to sympathize with in the person being hurt. In the early seasons, Peter's stupidity had a particular quality that is harder to describe than it sounds. He was not stupid in the way that sitcom dummies are often stupid, where the character essentially exists to be wrong so that the smarter characters can correct them. Peter's particular brand of incomprehension was more like a kind of cosmic confidence. He approached every situation with total certainty about his own understanding, and that certainty was almost always wrong, and the gap between his certainty and reality was where the comedy lived. He was a man sailing confidently in the wrong direction. Sure, he was heading home. What made this work as a characterization rather than simply as a comedic device was that underneath the stupidity there was a core of genuine feeling. Peter felt things. He loved people. When he hurt Lois, which he did constantly, through ignorance rather than malice, the hurt registered on his face when he understood it. When he damaged his friendships, he felt the damage. He was capable of shame, of regret, of the impulse to make things right. The specific texture of his love for Lois is worth dwelling on, because it is the thing the show eroded most consequentially. In the early seasons, Peter and Lois had a genuine marriage, imperfect, sometimes strained, held together by something that both of them valued and that the show treated as valuable. When they fought, the fight had stakes because their relationship had stakes. When they made up, the making up was satisfying because you had felt the weight of the conflict. The comedy of their dynamic was in the gap between their differences, Peter's recklessness and Lois's patience, Peter's obliviousness and Lois's perception, not in the destruction of the relationship itself. The show, across its run, progressively stripped away Lois's patience and dignity in ways that matched the stripping of Peter's lovability. By the middle and later seasons, Lois had become harder and colder, capable of genuine cruelty in directions the early Lois would not have gone. She joined in the abuse of Meg. She was sometimes as contemptuous of Peter as she was exasperated by him. The warm, imperfect marriage became a cold arrangement, and the comedy that had been built on the warmth of the arrangement had nowhere left to live. Starting around season 7 and accelerating sharply from season 8 onward, that emotional interiority was progressively hollowed out. Peter's stupidity stopped being a limitation and became a complete absence of empathy. He stopped feeling things in any consistent way. He stopped noticing when his actions harmed people. He stopped apologizing with any genuine feeling when the harm was pointed out to him. The lovable fool was becoming a man who functioned without emotional consequence. The specific examples that accumulate across the later seasons are notable for how they map the transformation. He leaves Lois to a perceived shark attack and saves himself. He steals Stewie's Halloween candy. He manipulates Joe into infidelity. He gets Brian fired out of jealousy. He abandons his daughter repeatedly, in ways framed as jokes, and shows no feeling when confronted about it. In the episode where Meg finally delivers her devastating speech about his behavior, Peter's response is laughter. Not the complicated laughter of someone laughing to cover pain. Just simple, flat amusement, like someone who has heard a mildly funny thing and wants to acknowledge it. The character who laughed at that speech was not Peter Griffin. He looked like Peter Griffin. He had Peter Griffin's voice. He wore Peter Griffin's clothes. But he was missing the thing that made Peter Griffin Peter Griffin. The knowledge, however dim, that the people around him mattered. There is a concept in television criticism that this kind of character change represents the same concept. The transcript you shared explores derived from a character in The Simpsons. The idea is that long-running characters get reduced to one or two dominant traits, stripped of everything else they were, until they are practically single-note. Peter's dominant trait, in the later seasons, was a combination of incomprehension and selfishness that left no room for the warmth that had originally made him funny. The physical violence that Peter either inflicted or was subjected to also changed in character. The giant chicken fight is the example most often cited, a recurring bit in which Peter encounters a particular giant chicken, and the two engage in elaborate, cartoonishly violent physical battles that destroy significant portions of the city. In its first iteration, this bit was genuinely funny because of its sheer commitment and its escalating absurdity. The fight kept going past any reasonable point, kept destroying more and more things, and the joke was in how far it went and how invested both combatants remained despite the total irrationality of the conflict. In later seasons, the show added similar sequences of extended violence involving Peter and other targets. But the violence became more graphically detailed, and the targets became more real members of his own family, strangers, people he was supposed to care about. The cartoon violence applied to cartoon situations was funny. The same visual energy applied to Peter harming people he loved was something different. The style was the same, but the content had changed enough that the style no longer provided the same comedic distance. Peter's friendships, his relationships with Joe Swanson, Cleveland Brown, and Quagmire also charted a descent across the seasons. These four men at the Drunken Clam were a genuine comedic ensemble in the early years. They had history together. They backed each other up. They went on adventures. Their friendship was the kind of male friendship that is often played for comedy precisely because men in American culture are so awkward about expressing the things they actually feel for each other. These four guys loved each other in their inarticulate way, and that love made their foolish group decisions funnier. In the later seasons, their dynamic curdled into something more toxic. Peter would do genuinely awful things to Joe or Quagmire and face no lasting consequence. The friendship became less like a brotherhood and more like a recurring proximity. Four people who happened to sit at the same bar and occasionally do horrible things to each other. The warmth was gone. What remained was habit. Joe Swanson's arc across the series is a small study in the larger decline. When Joe was introduced in Season 1, he was the admirable new neighbor, tough, capable, respected, someone the men on the street genuinely looked up to. Peter was jealous of him. Joe used a wheelchair, but the show initially handled his disability with a kind of matter-of-fact dignity. It was a part of who he was, not the only thing he was. By the later seasons, Joe's disability had become one of the show's most consistent sources of comedy, and not in ways that had anything to say about disability, culture, or human resilience. It was just Joe's in a wheelchair that is funny. The man who the other characters had once admired was now someone they mocked. That change in how the character was treated mapped perfectly onto the larger shift in what the show thought comedy was for. Section 7. Brian, Quagmire, and the Politics of Offense. Brian Griffin's decline, arguably more than Peter's, illustrates the specific way that the show's relationship with offensive content changed. Because Brian was the character most explicitly associated with intelligence and moral sensibility, his degradation had a particular ironic charge. He was the one who was supposed to know better, and watching him become steadily worse while continuing to believe he was the smartest person in the room was either brilliant character comedy or a failure of the writing, depending on which season you were watching. In the early seasons, Brian functioned as what comedy writers sometimes call the straight man, but a specific and sophisticated version of that function. He was not a straight man in the sense of having no comedic qualities. He was funny, often very funny, through his particular combination of sophistication and limitation, intelligence, and self-deception. He was the straight man to the family's collective chaos, which made the chaos funnier by contrast. And he was the audience's surrogate, the character who observed what was happening with the same awareness the audience had, who could be surprised and exasperated and amused on the audience's behalf. This is a valuable and technically demanding character function. The audience surrogate has to be sympathetic enough that the audience identifies with their perspective, observant enough that their observations feel like the right observations, and grounded enough in genuine character that their perspective feels like a perspective rather than just a framing device. Early Brian managed all of these requirements. He felt like a real consciousness navigating a ridiculous world. When a character who functions as an audience surrogate becomes someone the audience does not recognize or sympathize with, something fundamental breaks in the viewer's relationship with the show. They lose their point of entry. The show becomes something to observe from outside, rather than something to inhabit from inside. And without that interior relationship, without a character you are seeing through, rather than simply watching the comedy changes its character, you are watching people being funny rather than laughing alongside someone. The tragedy of late Brian Griffin is that he still has the architecture of the original. He still speaks with the same cadences. He still drinks martinis. He still has opinions about literature and politics. The voice is the same, the design is the same. But the thing that made him worth watching, the gap between his genuine intelligence and his very human limitations, played with affection and mild self-deprecating irony, has collapsed. In its place is a character defined by his worst qualities, presented with a frequency and an intensity that leaves almost no room for the qualities that made him worth spending time with. You can remember what Brian was. You can still see the outline of that character in the one that replaced him. But the outline is all that remains, and an outline without content is only a shape. The writers would argue, and have argued, that Brian's character flaws were always present, that the show was always depicting him as a hypocrite who did not live up to his stated values. There is truth in this. Early Brian drank too much. Early Brian was insecure. Early Brian sometimes gave advice that was self-serving rather than genuinely helpful. These were real flaws, carefully observed. But there is a difference between a character having flaws that are visible to the audience while the character remains functional and sympathetic, and a character becoming so comprehensively awful that their stated virtues are purely ironic. The early Brian's flaws were the imperfections of a basically decent person. They made him human. They gave him dimension. The later Brian's flaws swallowed him. The political soapboxing was, for many viewers, the first sign of the change, the moment when Brian stopped being a character who had opinions and started being a vehicle for opinions. Entire scenes would be constructed around Brian delivering a position on whatever political or social issue was on the writing room's mind that week. The position would be stated. Characters would respond. The scene would move on. But the scene existed primarily to deliver the position, and Brian's character was the wrapper around it rather than the source of it. Even viewers who agreed with Brian's politics found this irritating, because the naturalness of the character was being sacrificed. Real people with strong political views do not usually introduce every conversation as an opportunity to deliver those views. Brian was starting to do exactly that, and the gap between how an actual person with beliefs behaves and how Brian was now behaving undermined the sense that he was a person at all. Then came the behavior itself, documented across a series of episodes that collectively built a portrait of a character who was not just flawed but genuinely troubling. He gave Stewie a baby, his ostensible best friend Herpes, and the show treated this as a comedic situation rather than a catastrophic one. He destroyed Stewie's beloved bear Rupert in a drunken moment and responded to Stewie's distress with minimal remorse. In an episode that many fans point to as the moment Brian became genuinely hard to root for, he finds a woman trapped in a car, about to fall into the ocean, begins to rescue her, discovers she has a child, and is therefore presumably attached to someone, and lets go, allowing both the woman and her child to drown because she was not available for him to pursue romantically. This is not a character with flaws. This is a character who commits an act of lethal selfishness and is not destroyed for it, not broken by it, not even particularly troubled by it in any way the show dwells on. And the show presents it as comedy. The famous speech that Quagmire delivers to Brian in the Season 8 episode, Jerome is the New Black, is remarkable precisely because of what it represents. The show explicitly articulating, through one character, exactly why another character had become insufferable. Quagmire catalogs Brian's hypocrisy with specificity and venom. He calls him a fraud who pretends to be an intellectual. He calls him out for the failed writing career, the constant pursuit of Lois, the abandoned son. He calls Brian on everything. What makes this unusual is that the show clearly intended the audience to side with Quagmire in this moment. The writers knew Brian had become a problem. They were acknowledging it through this speech. But the acknowledgement changed nothing. The speech ended, the episode continued, and Brian remained exactly as Quagmire described him. In subsequent episodes, he got worse. The speech was not a turning point. It was a pressure valve, a way for the show to acknowledge a problem without actually addressing it. Quagmire himself is worth examining separately because his character trajectory runs parallel to the show's broader relationship with offensive content. In the early seasons, as discussed, Quagmire was a comedic exaggeration of hypersexuality absurd enough to function as satire. The joke was in the extremeness, and the extremeness maintained a certain awareness of itself as extreme. As the seasons accumulated, two things happened to Quagmire. The extremeness of his behavior increased, and the framing's ability to maintain satirical distance decreased. By the middle seasons, Quagmire was depicted doing things that, under any honest accounting, constituted serious sexual assault. He drugged women, he manipulated underage people, he engaged in statutory rape. In the Season 13 episode Quagmire's Mom, the show explicitly has Quagmire charged with statutory rape after sleeping with an underage girl, and the episode plays this largely as comedy, with Quagmire's mother being presented as the one who gets him out of the consequences. This is where the equal opportunity offender framing that the show and its producers often invoked runs into its clearest problem. Equal opportunity offense, as a comedic philosophy, posits that if you make fun of everyone equally, then no particular group is being singled out for degradation. The philosophy has some internal logic in some contexts, but it fails as a defense when the target of the joke is not a group's cultural practices or beliefs, but rather a group's right not to be sexually assaulted. Making jokes about sexual assault does not become acceptable through comprehensiveness. The equal opportunity argument provides no cover here, because the logic of the philosophy does not extend to treating all forms of violence as equally available for comedic material. The Parents Television Council documented this pattern in some detail in a study covering Family Guy episodes from 2012 through 2015, cataloging the frequency of sexual violence references, depictions, jokes, and implied acts within the show during that period. The council found the frequency high enough that they characterized it as a pattern rather than isolated incidents. Their conclusions were colored by their organization's general hostility to the show, but the underlying data, the number, and character of the incidents documented was verifiable. What the PTC study could not adequately capture was the question of intent, which is genuinely complicated. Some of the show's sexual violence content seemed to be in earnest satirical territory, attempting to use dark comedy to say something about how sexual violence gets treated in American culture. Some of it seemed to be shock value operating behind a satirical framing, and some of it seemed to have no coherent intent beyond simply doing the most extreme thing available in a given moment. Separating these three categories in practice is difficult, and the difficulty is itself a sign of the show's increasingly ambiguous relationship with its own content. It is worth noting, though, that the existence of genuine ambiguity in some cases does not exonerate the clearest ones. A show can sometimes be genuinely satirical about difficult topics and still sometimes deploy those same topics as pure shock material, and the existence of the genuine article does not transform the shock material into something more defensible. Both things can be true simultaneously. Family Guy sometimes made sophisticated use of dark content, and Family Guy sometimes made crude and indefensible use of the same categories of dark content. The difficulty of the second category does not disappear because the first category exists. Section 8. The Cutaway Machine. How the show's greatest tool became its greatest liability. The cutaway gag is the element of Family Guy that is most widely recognized, most imitated, most clipped and shared and referenced in popular culture. It is the show's signature in the way that a painter's brushwork is their signature, so characteristic, so associated with this particular creator's output, that you can often identify it without any other information. When someone who has never watched Family Guy asks what it is like, the cutaway gag is usually in the first few words of the answer. And that cultural centrality is part of the problem. Because when the cutaway gag became more famous than the show that contained it, when the format became more iconic than the stories, the relationship between the two had inverted, and the inversion had consequences that compounded over many seasons. To understand what happened to the cutaway gag over the course of Family Guy's run, it is useful to start with a simple question. What is the cutaway gag actually for? In the early seasons, the answer was clear and functional. The cutaway served as a compressed comedic reference, a way of illustrating a comparative statement with a visual joke that could be delivered more efficiently in 20 seconds of image than in several sentences of dialogue. Peter saying "this is worse than the time I" generates a cutaway that shows the referenced event with maximum immediacy and minimum setup. The joke is contained in the image, delivered quickly, and the episode moves on. The episode has lost no momentum. It has gained a supplementary joke. This is a real formal innovation. The combination of a conversational setup structure with a brief visual delivery mechanism creates a distinctive comedic rhythm that is genuinely different from either stand-up comedy or conventional sitcom punchline structure. It is, in a specific sense, a more efficient format for certain kinds of jokes than any of its predecessors. The early Family Guy was very good at exploiting this efficiency, finding cutaways that delivered maximum comic surprise per second, that came from unexpected angles on the references they were illustrating. That added something to the episode's texture without weighing it down. The problem was not the format. The problem was what happened to the relationship between the format and the show around it. It is the show's signature, and for the first several seasons it was deployed with genuine skill. Understanding what made it work and what changed about how it was used is essential to understanding the show's larger arc. In the early seasons, the cutaway gag was structurally analogous to the parenthetical aside in writing a brief detour that added something to the main line of thought before returning to it. A character in the middle of a scene would reference something, the screen would cut to a brief illustration of the thing referenced, and then cut back to the scene which continued from where it had left off. The cutaway was additive. It did not replace anything. It was a bonus joke nested inside the episode's main joke. This structure meant that the episode itself, its plot, its character dynamics, its emotional arc had to be strong enough to stand on its own. The cutaways were not carrying the show. They were decorating it. And because the writers knew the cutaways were decorative rather than structural, they treated them as craft objects, sharp, brief, punchy. A good early cutaway landed like a well-timed punchline, got out, and left you pleased. The length of early cutaways is notable when you time them against later ones. A typical Season 2 cutaway might run 15 to 20 seconds. A typical Season 12 cutaway might run 45 seconds to a minute and a half. The inflation in duration reflects a changing relationship between the cutaway and the episode around it. When cutaways are brief and the episode is strong, the cutaways are spice. When cutaways are long and the episode is thin, the cutaways are filler. By the middle seasons, episodes had been restructured implicitly, without any announced creative decision around the cutaway as the primary mode of comedy delivery. The main plot had become scaffolding. Characters would move through scenes whose function was essentially to generate opportunities for cutaway triggers. The "this is worse than the time I," or "it's like that time when" constructions that introduced a cutaway gag. The scene would set up the trigger, the cutaway would play, the scene would absorb the cutaway and generate another trigger. This created a particular kind of episodic experience where very little actually happened in the main timeline, but a large number of disconnected comedy sequences occurred alongside it. You could watch an episode and laugh at several individual moments while having no investment in or memory of the episode's actual story, because the story barely existed as a thing to be invested in. South Park made this criticism memorably and specifically in their two-part episode Cartoon Wars, which aired in 2006. Creators Trey Parker and Matt Stone depicted Family Guy's creative process as manatees randomly combining idea balls to generate jokes, a pointed suggestion that the show's cutaway humor was essentially random, requiring no skill or intention. The joke landed hard, partly because it was funny, and partly because there was observable truth in it. Parker and Stone have spoken about Family Guy in consistently dismissive terms, and the episode reportedly generated calls of appreciation from writers at The Simpsons and King of the Hill. The Conway Twitty gag is the example that gets cited most often as a demonstration of cutaway humor at its most purely nihilistic. In this recurring bit, an episode would reach a point where a cutaway might be expected, and instead of any joke, the show would simply cut to country singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs in full. No punchline, no twist, just the song, playing out to completion, while the audience waited. The first time this happened, it was unexpected enough to generate a laugh from sheer bewilderment. The second and third and fourth times, it was not a joke. It was dead air with a soundtrack. The show was aware that the Conway Twitty bit was a provocation, aware enough to keep doing it, while also aware enough to keep it to occasional appearances, rather than letting it run every episode. But the bit crystallized something about the show's later relationship with its own comedy format. It was a joke about the lack of a joke. It was the show openly acknowledging that sometimes there was no joke, that the space where a joke would be could simply be occupied by something else, and the audience could take it or leave it. The episode Back to the Pilot from Season 10 addressed the cutaway problem more directly and with genuine self-awareness. Brian and Stewie travel back in time to the first episode of the show, and while they are there, they observe the original characters standing around in awkward silence during a cutaway, simply waiting for it to end with nothing to do. The joke was that the cutaway format removes the characters from the story entirely. They are just paused in place while something unrelated happens. The meta-commentary was sharp. The irony was that the show used this self-aware critique and then continued using cutaways in exactly the same way in all subsequent episodes. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the show was capable of identifying its own structural problem with such clarity and choosing to continue the problem anyway. It suggests not ignorance but a conscious decision. The cutaway format, even as it hollowed out the episodes, was profitable, widely shared, and beloved by a significant portion of the audience. The show had become identified with the format. Changing it would have felt like a loss of identity to many viewers. So the format continued even as the writing room, at some level, knew what it was costing them. The consequence of this decision to continue using the format as a primary, rather than supplementary mode of comedy, had cascading effects that went beyond just episode quality. When the cutaway becomes the primary comedic delivery mechanism, the show's writers stop developing certain skills. The skill of constructing a plot that is funny in its own right, where the comedy emerges from the situation and the characters navigating it, is a skill that requires exercise to maintain. A writing room that can always fall back on cutaways to fill episodes does not need to develop this skill to the same degree. And over many seasons, that developmental gap becomes visible in the episodes that do not rely on cutaways. The plot-driven storytelling in the later seasons of Family Guy is often thin in ways that suggest the writers are less comfortable with it than the writers of the early seasons were. The Season 8 episode Brian and Stewie, which placed the two characters in a bank vault overnight with no cutaways, no gags, just two characters talking, was one of the most praised episodes in the show's history. It demonstrated that when the writing room was forced to rely on character and dialogue, rather than on the cutaway format's comedic infrastructure, it could produce genuinely affecting work. But the episode was exceptional rather than typical. It was an experiment in a different mode that proved the mode was available, and then the show returned to its established pattern. The experiment did not change the practice. It remained a data point, a proof of concept that the show acknowledged and then declined to act on. The episode Brian and Stewie from Season 8 stands as the clearest proof of what the show could do without cutaways. The episode locked the two characters in a bank vault for an entire episode with no plot, no cutaways, and nothing except the two characters talking to each other. What emerged from that constraint was one of the most moving episodes the show ever produced. Brian revealing that he keeps a gun in the vault because he has thought about ending his own life. Stewie revealing the depth of his love for Brian. Both characters showing dimensions that the show's usual format simply did not have room for. This episode did not change anything about how the show was made. It was an experiment, a detour, a demonstration that went unincorporated into the show's general approach. But it left a record proof that when Family Guy chose to tell a story, rather than assemble a collection of disconnected moments, it could do something that genuinely moved people. The question that hangs over the show's entire post-revival history is why that choice was made so rarely. The answer has something to do with the financial logic of the clip economy, something to do with the habits a writing room falls into over many seasons, and something to do with the fact that strong storytelling is harder to produce reliably than individual jokes. Writing a good cutaway gag is a specific, learnable craft skill. Writing a complete, satisfying, emotionally resonant story in 22 minutes is something else entirely. The path of least resistance ran toward the cutaway, and the show followed it. Section 9. Stewie, Identity and What Was Lost. The decision to transform Stewie from an evil genius into a softer, more emotionally accessible character is one of the most discussed creative choices in the show's history, and it divides fans in ways that reveal something real about what people want from animated comedy. Before getting into that division, it is worth sitting with what evil Stewie actually was, because descriptions of him evil, genius baby, who wants to dominate the world and kill his mother, do not fully capture why he was special. The description is accurate as a summary but insufficient as a characterization. What made Stewie special was the combination of a genuinely original premise with a performance McFarlane's voice work that found the exact register in which the comedy lived. The voice was crucial. The specific combination of formal, slightly archaic British diction, the precise theatricality of delivery, the way McFarlane could make Stewie's elaborate villainy sound both completely committed and slightly ridiculous. This was an irreplaceable element of why the character worked. The voice gave Stewie his dignity maintained in the face of his situation in diapers, surrounded by people who could not understand him, simultaneously more intelligent than everyone in the room and more physically helpless was the comedy. The archetype Stewie was drawing from has a long comedic history. The character who has enormous internal grandeur and no external power. Don Quixote. Many of the great comic characters in literature involve exactly this gap, a self-image wildly in excess of the reality, a dignity maintained in the face of circumstances that objectively do not support it. What made Stewie unusual was the inversion. Unlike most characters of this type, his internal grandeur was genuine. He actually was what he claimed to be. He actually had the intellect, the capability, the ambitions he described. The comedy was not in his delusion. It was in his real, legitimate, extraordinary qualities being trapped in the body and social position of an infant. It was in the universe's refusal to recognize what it was dealing with. This is a genuinely interesting comedic situation, and it had a genuinely inexhaustible range of comedic directions, none of which the show fully explored before choosing to abandon it. The case for the transformation is straightforward and not without merit. Evil Stewie was a one-premise character. He wanted to kill Lois and take over the world. Within those goals, he was endlessly inventive, but the goals themselves were fixed. There was a ceiling on the premise. At some point you have seen enough of the evil genius baby to have seen the shape of all the evil genius baby stories available. The writers felt they had reached that ceiling, and they chose to develop the character rather than repeat him. The development that followed gave Stewie genuine emotional range. His friendship with Brian became the show's most resonant relationship. The Road 2 episodes, Brian and Stewie traveling together, navigating strange situations with their mismatched temperaments, were consistently the show's most entertaining serialized content. Episodes like Road to the North Pole and Road to Germany showed that the Stewie-Brian dynamic could carry a complete story with real stakes, real feeling, and real comedy. Christmas Guy, the episode where Stewie uses a time travel device to save Brian's life, was genuinely moving. The friendship had been built with enough care that Brian's death felt like a real loss, and Stewie's sacrifice felt earned. These were real achievements. The soft Stewie era produced episodes that the show could be proud of. But, and it is a significant but, what was traded away was singular. There was one evil genius baby in the history of animated television. That character Stewie Griffin, as he existed in seasons 1 through 3, was a creation that had essentially no precedent and would not find many successors. The concept of an infant with a supervillain's vocabulary, ambitions, and apparatus, existing in a world where no adult could hear him clearly enough to understand him, was a comic premise with almost infinite potential directions. New machines, new schemes, new targets, new alliances. The constraint the writers felt that they had run out of evil genius baby story says more about the particular creative direction they were looking in than about the premise itself. The show eventually produced far more seasons of Soft Stewie than it ever did of Evil Stewie. By the time the show had run for 23 seasons, the ratio of seasons with Soft Stewie to seasons with Evil Stewie was roughly 7-1. If the writing room could find enough material for the softer characterization to sustain the character for that long, it is genuinely hard to argue that the evil genius premise had been exhausted. The evidence suggests instead that the writers found the evil genius premise challenging and chose to replace it with something that was easier to write for a character whose emotional interiority could be explored through dialogue, rather than through the mechanical invention of new schemes and devices. The show also increasingly used Stewie's sexuality as a dominant characterization element in the later seasons. From season 4 onward, his behavior included more openly feminine expression, cross-dressing, references to attraction to men, jokes about his gender presentation. This became so frequent in the middle and later seasons that for many viewers, Stewie effectively went from being defined by his evil genius to being defined almost entirely by comedy relating to his sexual and gender identity. The handling of this material was inconsistent and often clumsy. On one hand, Stewie's ambiguous sexuality was treated with more care than some of the show's other approaches to LGBTQ themes. The jokes were often aimed at the discomfort of those around Stewie, rather than at Stewie himself. On the other hand, the frequency of the jokes and their reduction of Stewie to a collection of references created a character whose identity had become a running bit rather than something explored with any genuine depth. The two-parter Stewie Kills Lois and Lois Kills Stewie from Season 6 is worth lingering on, because it functions as both a genuine creative achievement and an inadvertent announcement of an ending. In these episodes, Stewie finally does what he had been threatening to do since the very first episode he kills Lois. And then Lois turns out to have survived and returns for revenge, and the conflict between them plays out on a global scale, with Stewie in control of the world's governments and military forces. It was everything the evil genius premise had been building toward. It was thrilling and funny and dramatic. And then it was revealed to be a simulation. Stewie had been running the scenario on his computer, playing out the hypothetical. None of it had happened. Everything reset. The reset was clever as a structural choice. It allowed the show to have the dramatic payoff of Stewie actually achieving his goals, without having to commit to the narrative consequences of a show where the baby has actually murdered his mother. But the reset also said something about the show's relationship with consequence. Big things could happen, high-stakes scenarios could play out, and at the end it would all be undone. Nothing would stick. Nothing would matter beyond the episode in which it occurred. This became a guiding principle of the later seasons in ways that reached far beyond just the Stewie storyline. Characters would learn lessons and forget them. Relationships would be damaged and immediately repaired. Episodes would end with apparent resolutions that the next episode simply did not acknowledge. The show had adopted a kind of aggressive impermanence that served the convenience of episode-by-episode storytelling, but systematically prevented the show from building anything that would last. Stewie in the later seasons, stripped of his evil genius ambition and given a softer emotional character, occasionally still got to be brilliant. There were episodes where his intelligence and his theatrical personality generated genuinely funny material. But he was no longer dangerous, no longer unpredictable, no longer the character around whom every scene carried a charge of, what is he going to do now? He had become safe, and for a character defined by his refusal to be safe, that was the biggest transformation of all. Section 10. Race, Religion, and the Line That Kept Moving. The history of Family Guy's relationship with race and religion over its run is a story about a show that started with satirical aspirations toward these topics and gradually lost the discipline or the interest to maintain the satirical structure that would have given those aspirations meaning. To engage seriously with how the show handled these topics requires distinguishing between several things that are often conflated: the content of the jokes, the structure within which the jokes appeared, the intention of the people writing the jokes, and the effect the jokes had on the people who were their subjects. These are four different things. A joke can be well-intentioned and still harmful. A joke can engage with a true observation and still reinforce a damaging stereotype. A joke can have a satirical frame and still do something other than satire in the space created by that frame. The complexity is genuine, and it does not resolve into a simple verdict on any particular episode or joke. What can be observed with some precision across the show's run is the trajectory. The relationship between the offensive content and the satirical structure around it changed over time. The early show had more structure, the later show had less. And the loss of structure made the offensive content function differently in reception, in implication, and in the way it shaped the audience's relationship to its subjects. A useful distinction here is between jokes that are about a group and jokes that are for a group. Comedy about a marginalized group, at its most sophisticated, positions the audience alongside the group being referenced, inviting shared recognition of an absurdity rather than inviting contempt from outside. At its least sophisticated, it simply uses the group as the punchline, with the audience positioned as observers of someone else's difference or inferiority. The early Family Guy generally understood this distinction, even if it did not always apply it perfectly. The episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein worked as a piece of comedy about Jewish stereotypes because it positioned Peter's ignorance, his bumbling, uncritical acceptance of anti-Semitic tropes as the object of satire, not Jewish people. Max Weinstein was a full person. Peter's attitudes were the butt of the joke. The audience was invited to laugh at Peter, not with him. By contrast, the episode Baby Got Black from season 12, in which Cleveland's son Cleveland Jr. dates a black girl named Ariana, and the episode generates comedy around racial stereotypes of black masculinity and sexuality, operates in considerably murkier territory. The episode's comedy is built around stereotypes themselves. The stereotypes are the jokes, not a commentary on the stereotypes. The satirical frame is present only nominally, and the difference between a satirical frame that is doing structural work and a satirical frame that is purely decorative is the difference between dark comedy and stereotype deployment. Religion followed a parallel trajectory. The early show's engagement with religion, including the controversial episode that introduced the Church of the Fawns, was typically satirical of the human impulse toward religious devotion rather than of religious people themselves. The humor was about how that impulse attaches to various objects, some more theologically dignified than others. By the later seasons, episodes dealing with religion were more likely to be simply contemptuous of believers, of religious institutions, of the content of specific faiths, without the surrounding structure that would give the contempt satirical meaning. The episode The 2000-Year-Old Virgin from season 13, in which Jesus Christ becomes a recurring character who is depicted as a naive, somewhat dim young man trying to navigate modern dating, generated both appreciative and hostile reactions. The premise had satirical potential. The gap between the theological weight of the figure and the mundane realities of contemporary existence could generate genuine comedy, but the episode's execution was uneven, with the comedy sometimes finding that gap and sometimes simply using Jesus as a target for mockery without the surrounding structure that would distinguish mockery from satire. This inconsistency, sometimes doing the harder work of satirical construction, sometimes settling for simpler contempt or stereotype, is one of the show's most frustrating qualities in its middle and later seasons. Because the inconsistency makes it impossible to make a clean judgment. Every time the show validated the worst criticism of its approach, it was a few weeks away from an episode that demonstrated it could do better. And that perpetual proximity to its own best self made its worst choices harder to accept. The show's early episodes handled race with a kind of self-aware awkwardness that was itself part of the comedy. Peter Griffin's racial ignorance was visible to the audience as ignorance the show did not endorse his perspective, but rather used his perspective as a window into a particular kind of cheerful American obliviousness. When Peter said something racially uninformed, the comedy was in the gap between his certainty and his wrongness. The show's point of view, expressed through Brian or through Consequence or through the reaction of other characters, was positioned outside Peter's perspective and could see it for what it was. Over the seasons, that positioning became less consistent. Episodes about race increasingly put racist content in front of the audience without a clear satirical frame around it. The episode Baby Got Black from season 12 tackled interracial relationships through a combination of explicit racial jokes from multiple characters and a brief, underdeveloped acknowledgement of white privilege. The AV Club review of the episode described it as 20 minutes of bad racist jokes with a forced resolution at the end that tried and failed to redeem them. The issue was not that the show was engaging with race. Engagement with difficult topics is valuable in comedy, and Family Guy at its best had engaged with them productively. The issue was structural. The jokes about race were the comedy payload, and the frame around them, the ostensible satirical context, was too thin to bear the weight of what the jokes were doing. When a story's humor derives from racial stereotypes, and the framing that would critique those stereotypes is both brief and inconsistent with the story's plot, what the audience receives is the stereotype. The show's academic analysis has noted this tendency. A paper examining Family Guy's racial politics observed that the show gestures toward critique while collapsing the distinctions that critique requires. The humor in racially charged episodes frequently makes the stereotyped group the source of the comedy, rather than making the stereotyping itself the comedy. Those are two different things, and the show moved progressively from the second to the first as the seasons accumulated. Religion, a topic the show engaged with from its very first seasons, followed a similar arc. Early religious jokes were often directed at institutional religion's relationship with power, hypocrisy, and the gap between stated values and actual behavior. These are legitimate satirical targets with a long history in comedy. Peter's Irish Catholic upbringing and his father's rigid religiosity were used to generate comedy that was about the specific social dynamics of that tradition, rather than simply being hostile to religion. The later seasons' approach to religious content was less focused and sometimes more gratuitously offensive. Episodes featuring Jesus Christ as a character went through several iterations, some of them genuinely funny and pointed, others simply using the figure of Jesus as a vehicle for mild transgression without any real satirical purpose. The season 13 episode, The 2000-Year-Old Virgin, depicted Jesus as a manipulative womanizer who tricks gullible men into allowing him access to their wives, presenting the deception as a regular pattern. The episode was widely condemned by Christian viewers, and not because they objected to any satirical engagement with religious figures that has a long and legitimate history in comedy, but because the joke, in execution, had no real content beyond the transgression of depicting Jesus badly. There was no critique embedded in the characterization. The transgression was the entire point. The distinction between religious satire that says something and religious transgression that simply shocks has a long history in comedy. The best religious satire, Monty Python's Life of Brian being a prominent example, uses religious subject matter to make points about human nature, institutional power, the gap between faith and practice, or the ways that sincere belief gets corrupted by human weakness and ambition. These comedies are sometimes deeply offensive to believers, and their offense is sometimes appropriate because they are making arguments that cut at things worth cutting at. Family Guy's religious content in the later seasons was more often simply transgressive, depicting religious figures in undignified ways, because the undignity generated a reaction without the reaction being in service of any larger argument. This is not a failure of nerve or a failure of political commitment. It is a failure of craft. Craft is what transforms transgression into satire. Without the craft, you are left with the transgression alone, which is a much smaller thing. The show's approach to other religious traditions followed similar patterns. The Turban Cowboy episode, already discussed, is the most dramatic example of the show engaging with Islam in ways that generated harm without any compensating satirical value. The episode's nominal counter-message, one line from Joe noting that not all Muslims are terrorists, was entirely undermined by the plot, which validated the anti-Muslim stereotype it was supposedly challenging. This is not satire. This is using the structural language of satire, the setup, the nominal counter-perspective, the surface engagement with the topic to deliver content that is essentially propaganda. The episode's association with the Boston Marathon bombing was accidental, a terrible coincidence of timing that the show could not have anticipated. But the timing only amplified a problem that existed independent of the timing. The episode had, before the bombing, no legitimate satirical purpose. Its content was harmful not because of bad luck but because of choices made in the writing room. Other religious and ethnic groups got similar treatment across the show's run, with varying degrees of craft and care. Episodes dealing with Jewish characters ranged from the thoughtfully satirical When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, which used Jewish stereotypes to make a genuine point about Peter's ignorance and the nature of stereotyping, to later episodes that used Jewish stereotypes simply as quick, familiar comic triggers without any surrounding structure to give them meaning. The equal opportunity offender argument that because the show makes fun of everyone, no one is being singled out runs into consistent structural problems when examined closely. Equal opportunity and the frequency of offense does not equate to equal impact. Jokes that rely on stereotypes about groups that have been historically marginalized and dehumanized do not carry the same weight as jokes about groups that have held and continue to hold cultural and institutional power. A joke about Irish Catholic culture and a joke about a religious minority that has faced sustained prejudice and violence are not equivalent comedic objects regardless of their formal similarity. The show occasionally demonstrated awareness of this distinction. More often it ignored it. Section 11. Why the writers kept pushing further the escalation mechanic. To understand why Family Guy's offensive content escalated consistently across its run rather than finding a stable level, it is necessary to understand something about the economics of attention and the psychology of the writing room that produced it. Comedy writing rooms are specific and interesting social environments. They are places where the social currency is laughter, where the measure of contribution is whether what you say in the room makes other people in the room laugh. This creates a particular dynamic that rewards the unexpected, the extreme, the willingness to go somewhere that feels slightly too far. In any given room, the person who says the thing that was just past the line of comfort is the person who generates the biggest reaction. And generating the biggest reaction is the point. This dynamic means that writing rooms tend to normalize increasingly extreme content over time. What generates a reaction at the beginning of a season no longer generates the same reaction by the end of it. What got a big laugh in Season 2 is table stakes by Season 7. The room's internal sense of what is far enough is calibrated against what the room has already accepted, and that calibration moves in one direction. This is not pathology. It is the normal functioning of a creative environment that rewards the extreme. It is the same dynamic that produces extremely edgy stand-up comedy, extremely violent action movies, extremely dark dramatic television. The people working in these forms are in competition with each other, and with the accumulated standard of what their audience has already seen, and that competition consistently pushes toward more. The specific structure of the Family Guy writers' room amplified this dynamic in ways that were particular to the show. The cutaway format meant that extreme jokes could be tested in isolation. You could propose a cutaway gag that was genuinely extreme and evaluate it as a 30-second standalone comedy moment without having to consider its relationship to character or story. A joke that would be impossible to embed in a plot-driven context because it would require the characters to do something that their characterization did not support could be deployed as a cutaway with no such constraint. The cutaway was a consequence-free zone for content that would otherwise be impossible. This created a specific escalation path, extreme content that could not be accommodated in the show's narrative because it violated character or story logic could always be accommodated as a cutaway. And because the cutaway format was the show's most commercially successful element, the most shared, most clipped, most virally distributed content, the extreme cutaway was also the highest rewarded content. The combination of a low content barrier and a high commercial reward produced exactly the escalation you would predict. To understand why Family Guy's offensive content escalated consistently across its run rather than finding a stable level, it is necessary to understand something about the economics of attention and the psychology of the writing room that produced it. The show was built, from its earliest seasons, on the premise that it would go places other shows would not. This was part of its identity and part of its commercial appeal. It positioned itself against a backdrop of television that it characterized as sanitized and risk-averse, and it offered itself as the alternative, the show that would say what others were afraid to say, go where others were afraid to go. That positioning was commercially valuable and creatively generative in the early seasons, because there was genuine territory to explore. But here is the problem with a show that defines itself by transgression. Transgression is not a fixed category. What shocked an audience in 1999 did not shock the same audience in 2005. What pushed the boundary in Season 2 was inside the boundary by Season 8. To maintain the show's self-defined identity as the one that went further, it had to keep going further. Not by design. not through any explicit editorial decision, but through the implicit logic of a show that had staked its identity on being the most extreme version of itself. This is a common dynamic in media that builds its audience on transgression. What initially constitutes boundary pushing becomes normalized through repetition, and the boundary must be pushed again to generate the same reaction. The audience develops a tolerance for the extreme content, and the show must escalate to maintain the feeling of transgression. The process has its own momentum, and it runs in only one direction. The internet amplified this dynamic dramatically. The clip culture that emerged with YouTube in 2005 created a specific reward structure for the most extreme content. The clips that got shared most widely were often the most shocking, the most graphic, the most offensive, the most outrageous. A mild cutaway gag from Season 2 did not generate the same shareability as an extreme piece of shock comedy from Season 9. The feedback loop of attention and shares provided a constant, real-time signal to the writing room about what generated response, and the signal consistently pointed toward more extreme content. This feedback dynamic was not unique to Family Guy. It affected all television comedy in the clip era. But Family Guy's existing identity as a transgressive show meant it was particularly susceptible to the pressure, and its cutaway format made individual shocking moments easier to extract from context and circulate. A shocking moment in a sitcom exists within an episode. A shocking cutaway in Family Guy existed on its own as soon as someone clipped it and uploaded it. The writing room also operated under specific pressures that shaped the content. Writers for late-season Family Guy were working on a show with a long history of shocking content, a specific identity associated with that content, and an audience that, by that point, was largely self-selected for tolerance of extreme material. Writing for an audience that expects extremeness and has signaled its approval of it creates a particular environment, one where the incentive is to find the new extreme rather than to ask whether the previous extreme was the right choice. Seth MacFarlane's partial withdrawal from active, creative oversight of the show, around 2011, removed the one figure most likely to be a consistent moderating influence on this process. MacFarlane's own instincts were not always toward restraint. He has acknowledged in interviews that some of his own creative choices in the early seasons were too far, but he had the institutional memory of what the show was for and what it was trying to say. The writers who ran the show in his absence were technically skilled and genuinely committed, but they were operating in a creative environment where the incentive structure consistently pointed toward escalation. The hiring pattern of the writing room also matters. Comedy writing rooms often develop specific cultures, and those cultures can be self-reinforcing. A room that has developed a high tolerance for offensive material and that has built its identity around finding the new limit creates an environment where the more extreme options consistently find advocates and the more moderate options consistently feel like concessions. This is not a conspiracy or a deliberate choice. It is a natural dynamic of group creative process. But its consequences are visible in the arc of the show's content. The addition of more women to the writing staff in later seasons, beginning to have effect around season 14 and 15, is credited by some observers with shifting this dynamic. The treatment of Meg began to change. Certain kinds of content that had been standard became less prevalent. The room's internal culture shifted enough to produce different outcomes at the page level. This is not a simple story about gender and comedy. It is a story about what happens when a room's composition and perspective diversifies enough to generate genuine internal friction around content decisions. There is also a question about the show's relationship with its critics that shaped its content choices. Family Guy's relationship with organizations like the Parents Television Council was explicitly adversarial, and that adversarialism became part of the show's identity. The PTC attacked the show repeatedly and publicly, filed FCC complaints, published reports, lobbied networks. The show responded by making the PTC a recurring target. An episode called PTV, for instance, was essentially a direct satirical attack on censorship advocacy and the PTC specifically. This dynamic created a situation where the show's identity was partly constructed in opposition to its critics. To push back against censorship advocacy was to do the thing the advocates were complaining about, to keep making the content they objected to. The more the PTC called the show offensive, the more the show's identity required it to be offensive. The critics and the show were locked in a mutually sustaining loop, each defining themselves partly through their opposition to the other. This is an unusual creative position to be in, and it had unusual creative consequences. When the thing you need to do to maintain your identity is the thing your critics say you should stop doing, You can end up doing it past the point where you would have stopped for purely creative reasons. The opposition becomes its own justification for continuation. MacFarlane has spoken about this in general terms, framing the show's persistence in transgressive territory as a defense of comedy's right to go to uncomfortable places. He has described a philosophy of equal opportunity offense and defended specific episodes as operating within a satirical tradition that values discomfort as a comedic tool. These are principled positions with real intellectual backing. The question is whether the show consistently executed those principles, or whether the principles were, in many seasons, a retrospective justification for content that was generated through less principled processes. The tension between these two readings is not fully resolvable because it requires access to the intentions of specific writers in specific rooms, which is not something that can be definitively established from outside. What can be established is the content itself and its trajectory across the seasons. The early content had a satirical logic that was visible in its execution. The later content was more variable. Some of it maintained that logic, some of it operated as pure shock, some of it occupied an uncomfortable middle space where the intent was unclear and the effect was troubling. The trajectory was not uniform decline. It was an increasing proportion of the problematic relative to the functional, a ratio that accumulated over seasons into a very different show than the one that had premiered in 1999. Section 12. Where the show stands now and what it tells us. Family Guy was renewed in April 2025 in a deal described as a mega renewal with parent company Disney, extending the show through its 27th season and the 2028 to 2029 television season. The deal was widely reported and treated as significant entertainment news, which it was not because the show's current cultural footprint particularly justified it, but because the deal illuminated something important about how the entertainment industry now values intellectual property and brand recognition independently of any particular program's current quality or viewership. The numbers that frame this renewal are worth sitting with for a moment. Family Guy premiered to approximately 22 million viewers. Its peak post-revival viewership was around 7.9 million average viewers across Season 4. Season 13 averaged approximately 5.86 million. Season 20 averaged 1.31 million. Season 23 averaged approximately 723,000 viewers, and the show was renewed through Season 27. To put those numbers in perspective, the show lost roughly 90% of its post-revival audience across 20 seasons. Less than 1 in 10 people who were watching Family Guy when it returned in 2005 were watching it by its 23rd season. In any industry that measured success purely by the relationship between a product and its current consumers, this would be an unambiguous story of commercial failure. But the entertainment industry does not measure success purely that way, and has not for some time. The relationship between a show's first-run viewership and its total commercial value has become increasingly decoupled as the platforms through which content is distributed have multiplied. Family Guy airs new episodes on Fox, but it is also on Hulu, where it is a significant driver of subscribers. It airs in reruns on multiple cable networks simultaneously. It is globally recognized as a brand. It generates merchandise revenue. It is a licensing asset with established market value across multiple categories. The renewal makes sense as a commercial decision under these conditions. The show has built enough of a value ecosystem around itself that the cost of continuing to produce 15 new episodes per season relatively low, given the economics of animation is justified by the revenue those episodes contribute to the ecosystem. The show does not need to be watched by many people on Wednesday nights to justify its existence commercially. It needs to be recognized as Family Guy to maintain the brand that generates value across all the other channels. This is a genuinely interesting and slightly strange situation for a creative enterprise to be in. The show continues not because it has an audience that demands new episodes, but because it has a brand that generates value through its continuation. The audience for new episodes is small and shrinking. The value of the brand is large and stable. These two facts coexist, and the second one determines whether the show keeps going. Each season would consist of 15 episodes. The show that had premiered to 22 million viewers on Super Bowl night in 1999 was being guaranteed years of additional production in 2025, despite averaging fewer than 800,000 viewers per episode in its most recent completed seasons. This paradox, a show with a tiny fraction of its original audience being renewed for years of future production, tells you something important about how television economics works in the current era. Family Guy no longer derives its value primarily from the people who watch new episodes as they air on Wednesday nights. Its value lives in the ecosystem built around it: the streaming rights on Hulu, the reruns on Adult Swim and Comedy Central and FXX, the merchandise, the video games, the licensing. The show has been running long enough to have accumulated a library of content with real commercial value, independent of whether any particular new episode finds a large audience. This is not a story unique to Family Guy. It is a story about the changing economics of television entertainment and about what happens when a show's continued existence is driven by commercial logic rather than creative necessity. But Family Guy is an unusually clear example of the dynamic, partly because of how dramatically its ratings have declined, and partly because of how transparently its creator has framed the show's continuation in financial and charitable terms rather than creative ones. MacFarlane, in a 2024 interview, described the show's continuation in terms of its financial utility. It generates revenue that funds causes he cares about, including environmental conservation. He noted that there was a time when he thought it was right to end the show, but that the audience's continued engagement had argued against that. He framed the show as having reached what he called escape velocity, a state of self-sustaining momentum where it no longer needed a particular creative justification to continue. This framing is honest, which is worth acknowledging. MacFarlane was not claiming ongoing creative passion for the show in that interview. He was describing a show that continues because it can, because it serves purposes beyond its own quality, and because the audience, however diminished, still exists. That is a legitimate position. It is also a position that tells you something about why the show has the creative character it does in its later seasons. A show made by a creator with burning enthusiasm for the story he is telling looks and feels different from a show being competently maintained by skilled professionals in the creator's partial absence. Both kinds of shows can produce quality episodes, but the first kind produces them consistently and systematically. The second kind produces them occasionally and inconsistently, with long stretches of functional but uninspired work surrounding the occasional genuine achievement. The later seasons of Family Guy have this character functional, occasionally brilliant, more often familiar, and sometimes troubling. Episodes like Brian and Stewie demonstrated that the talent was still there and could still produce something genuinely affecting. Episodes like Turban Cowboy demonstrated the specific danger of that talent operating without sufficient creative oversight or satirical discipline. What the show's full trajectory tells us, considered as a whole, is something about the relationship between creative vision and institutional momentum. Family Guy was built on a specific vision, MacFarlane's vision of a particular kind of American family comedy that was edgy but warm, transgressive but sympathetic, capable of offending you and making you care in the same episode. That vision sustained the show through its golden era. When the vision became less central to the show's day-to-day operation, the institutional momentum of the show, its format, its identities, its commercial incentives kept it moving in directions that the original vision would not necessarily have chosen. The escalation of offensive content across the seasons was not a plan. Nobody sat in a room and decided to make Family Guy progressively more extreme over the course of 20 years. It happened through accumulated small decisions, each of which seemed defensible or at least explainable in its immediate context, but which together produced a trajectory that is unmistakable in retrospect. Each new extreme became the new baseline from which the next extreme was measured. Each fresh season's writing room inherited the content decisions of all the previous seasons as simply the existing standard. This is how institutional drift works in any creative enterprise. It is not dramatic, and it is not villainy. It is just the compounding of small choices over time, the gradual normalization of whatever has come before, and the constant pressure of an identity defined by going further. The audience that has stayed with the show across all of this is an interesting group to think about. They are not a monolith. Some of them have stayed because they genuinely enjoy the later content. Some have stayed out of habit and affection for the early seasons, watching despite rather than because of the more extreme content. Some have filtered watching selectively, seeking out the episodes that still work and skipping the ones that do not. And some have left entirely, becoming the viewers behind those declining ratings numbers, people who loved the early show and found that the later show was not the same show. The viewers who have left are not wrong. The later show is not the same show. The characters are not the same characters. The comedy is not the same comedy. The early show had something, call it warmth, call it heart, call it a satirical center that the later show has only intermittently and unreliably. But the viewers who have stayed are not wrong either. There are things the later show does that the early show could not have done: the depth of the Brian-Stewie relationship, the genuine emotion of certain late-season episodes, the self-awareness that comes from a show that has been thinking about itself for 2 decades. These are real things, not imaginary ones. The truth of Family Guy across its full run is complicated, which is appropriate for a show that has always resisted simple characterization. It was a genuine creative achievement in its early seasons. It became something different, sometimes impressive, sometimes troubling, often inconsistent in its later ones. The mechanism by which it became different is traceable and explicable. The decision to understand that mechanism is the decision to understand something real about how creative institutions sustain and change themselves, about how commercial logic and creative vision interact, and about the specific challenge of maintaining satirical integrity across an enterprise that has been running for a quarter century. There is still something worth watching in the later seasons of Family Guy, but watching it now, knowing what you know about how it started and what it was, requires a kind of active discrimination, an ability to see what the show is in any given episode, to appreciate the moments that still work, and to understand the moments that don't. That ability to watch critically rather than passively is, in its own way, something the show's long, troubled history has given its audience. Discomfort, when it teaches you to pay attention, is not always a loss. Section 13. The specific anatomy of escalation, how individual episodes push the line. The abstract story of Family Guy's escalating offensiveness is clearest when you examine specific episodes across the show's run and trace the way each one moved the line. Not because any individual episode is the definitive turning point, there is no single moment that changed everything, but because each episode in sequence shows you the accumulation in real time. The new normal established by one episode becomes the floor from which the next episode measures how far to go. In the early seasons, specific episodes generated controversy not because they were gratuitously offensive, but because they engaged seriously with genuinely difficult material. The episode Death Has a Shadow, the very first episode of the show, involves Peter losing his job and collecting welfare fraudulently. The episode is a satire of welfare dependency myths, of lazy policy thinking, of the specific irresponsibility of a certain kind of American male who finds it easier to game a system than to do the right thing. It is sharp. It is edgy. It is sometimes offensive in the way that genuinely pointed satire is sometimes offensive. But it is saying something. The episode titled The Father, the Son, and the Holy Fawns from Season 4 introduces Peter's idea to start a church based around the fawns from Happy Days, with genuine religious reverence applied to a beloved 1970s sitcom character. The episode is a satire of how American popular culture functions as a kind of secular religion, of how devotion gets channeled into cultural objects, of the gap between the spiritual needs people have and the inadequate things they sometimes direct those needs toward. Again, it is sometimes uncomfortable. It earns the discomfort by having something to say. Now compare those episodes to something like Quagmire's Quagmire from Season 12, in which Quagmire meets a woman who is as sexually voracious and aggressive as he is, and the episode involves extended comedy about sexual torture, manipulation, and exploitation. The comedy here is not about anything. It is not a satire of Quagmire's worldview, or of masculine sexual culture, or of the dynamics of unhealthy relationships. It is simply the content, presented as comedy because it is extreme. The extremeness is the point. Nothing else is. Between those two eras, between episodes that had something to say and episodes that were simply extreme, lies a progression of small moves. Each season, a few episodes pushed slightly further than the one before. Each season, the audience absorbed the new content as the new standard. Each season, the writing room's sense of what was too far shifted slightly in the direction of what had previously been too far. The episode Stewie Kills Lois, whatever its larger narrative function as a farewell to the original Stewie characterization, is also a data point in this progression. Stewie actually follows through on his stated goal. He kills Lois. The show depicts this, plays out the aftermath, and only then reveals it to have been a simulation. But the simulation allowed the show to put the content on screen, the actual consequence of Stewie's ambition, in a way that could be defended as fictional, within the fiction while still being present as actual content. The layer of remove is thinner than it appears. The show is showing you Stewie killing Lois. The simulation frame does not fully diffuse the content. It provides a narrative excuse for including it. The episode And Then There Were Fewer from Season 9 attempted something genuinely different. A murder mystery episode structured like an Agatha Christie thriller, with recurring characters being killed off one by one in a country house. Several characters actually die in the episode, permanent deaths, not reset in the following week. This was unusual for the show and demonstrated that it could commit to consequence when it chose to. The episode received positive reviews and was remembered as one of the later season's stronger achievements. But it did not establish a pattern. The next several episodes returned to the standard approach. No real consequences, no lasting change. The episode Partial Terms of Endearment from Season 8 is a particular case, one where the controversial content was the subject of genuine ethical disagreement rather than simply shock. Lois becomes a surrogate mother for a couple, who are then killed, leaving Lois to decide whether to continue the pregnancy or have an abortion. Fox refused to air the episode in the United States and even asked Adult Swim not to air it. The episode was released on DVD and aired in other markets. This was the only Family Guy episode ever banned from American broadcast. What is interesting about this episode, and what makes it different from most of the show's controversial content, is that the episode is not gratuitously offensive in its execution. The abortion storyline is handled with more care and genuine engagement than you might expect from a show with Family Guy's track record with difficult topics. The controversy was real. The topic generates real controversy, regardless of how it is handled, but the handling was, by the show's own later standards, thoughtful. Fox's refusal to air it said more about the network's corporate risk calculations than about the episode's quality. The banana peel slope of escalation in the show's sexual violence content is visible when you chart the specific Quagmire episodes across the seasons. Season 1. Quagmire is a hypersexual neighbor who makes aggressive come-ons to women and is played as an absurd caricature of a specific masculine type. Season 4. Quagmire is shown in situations that are darker but still mostly framed as clearly comedic exaggeration. Season 7. The season premiere features Quagmire dealing with the discovery that his friend Cleveland had an affair with Loretta, and the show allows itself to engage with the genuine hurt of that situation. Season 8. Quagmire's Dad, with the transphobic content already discussed. Season 12. Quagmire's Quagmire, with the sexual torture content. Season 13. Quagmire's Mom, where Quagmire is charged with statutory rape. Each season is slightly beyond the previous one. The line is always just ahead of where you are standing. What makes this progression worth tracing so carefully is that it was not the result of a single bad creative decision. It was the result of hundreds of small decisions, each one extending slightly beyond the one before, none of them individually decisive, all of them together producing a result that would have been unrecognizable if you could have jumped from Season 1 directly to Season 13 without the intervening journey. The show's treatment of race followed a parallel trajectory. In the early seasons, racial jokes had satirical frames. The offense was embedded in a structure that gave it meaning. In the middle seasons, the frames became less consistent, the jokes more likely to rely on the stereotype rather than examine it. In the later seasons, some episodes engaged with race with genuine sophistication. The white privilege moment in Baby Got Black, however brief and underdeveloped, was a real observation placed in a real comedic context, while others simply deployed racial stereotypes as comedy triggers without surrounding structure. This inconsistency is itself part of the story. The show never fully abandoned its satirical aspirations. In any given season, you could find an episode that demonstrated real craft and real satirical purpose alongside an episode that was simply extreme. The inconsistency made it harder to make a clean judgment about the show's direction, harder to say definitively that it had crossed a line, because the next episode might be exactly the kind of smart, sharp comedy that reminded you what the show could do. The difficulty of making that clean judgment was part of what allowed the escalation to continue. You were always watching for the next good episode, and that watchfulness kept you present through episodes that you might have abandoned if you had known how many more like them were coming. Section 14. The audience's role in the escalation. Any honest account of why Family Guy kept getting more offensive has to include the audience, because the audience was not a passive recipient of the show's choices. The audience participated actively in creating the conditions under which those choices were made. This is not an argument that the audience is responsible for the show's choices. The people who make creative decisions are responsible for those decisions. But it is an argument that the audience's character, preferences, and behaviors shaped the environment in which those decisions were made, and that any account of the escalation that leaves the audience out is incomplete. The specific character of Family Guy's post-revival audience was shaped by the unusual path the show took back to production. 3 years of cancellation, followed by an Adult Swim revival driven by passionate fans, followed by a return driven by that passion's commercial demonstration. This path selected for a particular audience. It selected for people who were committed enough to seek the show out during its canceled period, emotionally invested enough to count themselves as part of the community that had kept it alive, and ideologically aligned with what the show represented as a cultural object. Transgression, irreverence, willingness to go where other shows would not. This is a highly engaged audience, but it is also a specific audience with specific expectations that differ from the expectations of a more casual viewership. Casual viewers want to be entertained. They enjoy shows that are good and stop watching shows that are not. Highly engaged fans want to belong to something. They want the show to maintain and confirm its identity as the thing they are fans of. When the show's identity is built on transgression, the highly engaged fan has a stake in the transgression continuing. Each new extreme is a confirmation that the show is still the real, uncompromised version of itself. Each pullback is a potential betrayal. Any honest account of why Family Guy kept getting more offensive has to include the audience, because the audience was not a passive recipient of the show's choices. The audience was an active participant in the escalation dynamic, and understanding how is essential to understanding why the show went where it went. When Family Guy returned in 2005, it found an audience that had been waiting for 3 years. This audience was self-selected for loyalty and passion. They were people who had watched reruns on Adult Swim, who had bought DVDs, who had participated in online communities dedicated to keeping the show's memory alive during its cancellation. This was not a casual audience. These were people who had invested in the show in a way that the original Season 1 audience had not been asked to invest. Invested audiences have specific characteristics as an audience. They are more likely to be enthusiastic, more likely to share content, more likely to defend the show against criticism, and more likely to reward the show for going further than other shows would go. The revival audience had bonded with Family Guy through its willingness to transgress, and that transgression was part of what they were celebrating when it returned. The clip economy that emerged with YouTube amplified this existing dynamic. When Family Guy cutaway gags started circulating on the platform, when individual 30-second moments from episodes were seen by millions of people who had not watched the full episode, the measure of the show's success shifted. It shifted from ratings, which measured how many people watched a complete episode, toward virality, which measured how many people engaged with an individual moment. These are different metrics with different incentive implications. A rating success requires an entire episode to be good enough to hold viewers from beginning to end. A viral success requires a single moment to be extreme, or funny, or shocking enough to generate a share. These are not contradictory goals. The same episode can achieve both, but they are different goals. And when they come into conflict, they produce different choices. An episode optimized for ratings is an episode with strong storytelling and consistent character work. An episode optimized for virality is an episode with several individually extreme or surprising moments, regardless of how they relate to each other or to any surrounding story. Family Guy was, for much of its post-revival run, producing content that was increasingly optimized for the second goal while nominally aiming at the first. The cutaway that generated millions of YouTube views became the measure of the episode's success. The episode's story was measured against a different, lower bar. And over time, the lower bar became the actual bar, the thing you reliably tried to clear, while the higher bar became the aspirational one you sometimes achieved. The online communities around Family Guy also contributed to the escalation dynamic in specific ways. Forums and fan sites where the show was discussed and celebrated developed their own cultures, and those cultures were often organized around the most extreme content. Discussions of favorite episodes tilted toward the ones with the most outrageous moments. Favorite cutaways were the most shocking ones. The shared vocabulary of the fan community was built around the show's transgressive moments in ways that created social rewards for the show continuing to produce transgressive content. When a show's most dedicated fans reward it specifically for its transgressive content, when the fan community's shared identity is organized around that content, the show receives a clear signal about what its audience values most. And the production, which is aware of and responsive to its audience's character in various ways, will tend to respond to that signal, not consciously, not through deliberate policy, but through the accumulated small choices of individual writers who understand what their audience is looking for and want to give them something they will enjoy. The critics who attack the show, the Parents Television Council, and similar organizations played a role in this audience dynamic as well. The PTC's consistent public condemnations of Family Guy were counterproductive as advocacy precisely because they were effective as marketing. When the PTC called a Family Guy episode the worst show of the week, the announcement reached audiences who used that designation as a recommendation. The show that the PTC hated was the show you were supposed to watch if you were the kind of person who rejected the PTC's values. Every condemnation was a signal to a specific audience that this was the real, uncompromised version of adult comedy that the concerned parents were trying to suppress. This dynamic is not unique to Family Guy. It applies broadly to cultural products that build identities around transgression against mainstream norms. The condemnation and the fanbase sustained each other. The condemnation gave the fanbase its sense of being part of something genuinely subversive. The fanbase gave the condemnation something concrete to point at. Both sides needed the other. And the show, positioned at the center of this dynamic, had every commercial incentive to keep occupying it. What this meant in practice for the show's content was that there was a specific kind of reputational risk attached to pulling back. To moderate the show's content would have been read by the fan community that defined itself through the show's transgression, and by the critics who defined themselves through opposing it as capitulation, as having finally been broken, as proving that the pressure campaigns worked. The cost of being seen as having been cowed was real and commercially legible, and it created a situation where continuation of the offensive content was, in certain respects, the path of least resistance. This is one of the more interesting and counterintuitive aspects of the escalation story. The show was partly trapped by its own success in occupying a particular cultural position. To do less would have been to lose something that was commercially valuable and institutionally identified. To do more was to follow the logic of an escalation that had its own momentum. The exits from this dynamic required a degree of creative courage and willingness to accept short-term costs that the show's institutional circumstances did not encourage. Section 15. What dark comedy actually requires: the craft that gets lost. There is a long tradition of genuinely dark comedy in American culture comedy that engages with death, suffering, violence, prejudice, and the full range of human cruelty without flinching, and that manages to be both genuinely funny and genuinely ethical. Understanding this tradition, clearly understanding what it actually requires, what distinguishes its best examples from its worst ones, makes it possible to be precise about what Family Guy lost and when it lost it. The foundation of the tradition is something simple but demanding. The comedy must be in service of truth, not comfortable truth, not flattering truth, but truth, some genuine observation about how human beings are, how societies function, how the gap between our stated values and our actual behavior creates situations that are both painful and absurd. Dark comedy at its best is a diagnostic tool. It shows you what would otherwise be too uncomfortable to look at directly, makes it visible through the medium of comedy's emotional distance, and thereby generates both laughter and recognition simultaneously. This dual payload, laughter and recognition, is what distinguishes dark comedy from mere darkness. Simple darkness produces only the discomfort. Simple shock produces only the reaction. Dark comedy produces the reaction, and then, a fraction of a second later, the recognition of what the reaction is actually about. You laugh, and in laughing you acknowledge something you might not have been willing to acknowledge otherwise. The laughter is the vehicle for the acknowledgement. This is hard to do well. It requires knowing what the target actually is, not just vaguely pointing at something uncomfortable, but identifying specifically what about it is worth comedic attention and why. It requires a comedic structure that delivers the observation at the right moment, in the right form, with enough surprise that the recognition lands before the discomfort can close the door. And it requires genuine humanity in the treatment, a sense that the people or situations being examined are real, that their suffering is real, that the comedy is not a denial of the suffering but a way of holding it. There is a long tradition of genuinely dark comedy in American culture. Comedy that engages with death, suffering, violence, prejudice, and the full range of human cruelty without flinching, and that manages to be both genuinely funny and genuinely ethical. Understanding that tradition, and understanding what the craft requirements of dark comedy actually are, makes it easier to see exactly where Family Guy in its later seasons departed from the tradition it claimed membership in. The roots of American dark comedy are deep and varied. Lenny Bruce made audiences uncomfortable and then made them laugh, using the discomfort itself as a diagnostic tool, showing the audience what they were afraid to confront by confronting it directly. Richard Pryor's stand-up addressed race, addiction, violence, and death with an unflinching honesty that could be devastating and hilarious within the same sentence. George Carlin's later work engaged with mortality, human stupidity, and the comprehensive failure of social institutions with a precision and darkness that his earlier material had never approached. These comedians and many others made work that was deeply offensive to someone, in almost every case, and that also had genuine insight, genuine craft, and genuine humanity. What all of these forms of dark comedy share is that the darkness is in service of something. It is directed at a specific target: human cowardice, institutional hypocrisy, the gap between professed values and actual behavior, the ways that people avoid acknowledging what they know to be true. The darkness is the vehicle for observation. The discomfort it generates is the discomfort of recognition, of seeing something true that you would have preferred not to see. Good dark comedy about race does not simply make racist jokes. It uses the material of race, the specific textures of racial dynamics in American society, the specific ways that racism operates and is rationalized, and is sometimes confronted to illuminate something about how race functions in human culture. The comedy is generated by the illumination, by the shock of recognition, by the absurdity of the gap between what America says about race and what race actually does. The offense, when it exists, is a side effect of the honesty, not the goal. Early Family Guy operated within this tradition, imperfectly but recognizably. The satire was often pointed. The darkness served observations. Peter's ignorance was a vehicle for showing something true about a certain kind of American male. The evil genius baby was a vehicle for showing something true about the gap between appearance and reality, between how we perceive innocence and what they might actually be. Even the most extreme content in the early seasons was connected to something, to a perspective on the world that the show was articulating through the extremeness. The tradition requires three things that are harder to maintain than they look: a specific target, a clear perspective on that target, and a comedic structure that delivers the perspective in a way that generates genuine laughter rather than just discomfort. Remove any one of these elements and you no longer have dark comedy. You have dark content presented in a comedy format. When Family Guy lost its satirical structure in the middle and later seasons, when the targets became vague, the perspective became unclear, and the comedic structure collapsed into extremeness for its own sake, it stopped doing dark comedy and started doing something else. Something that looked like dark comedy from the outside, had the same formal characteristics, deployed the same kinds of material, but that lacked the interior logic that turns dark material into dark comedy. The Conway Twitty gag, again, is the most explicit evidence of this transformation. Dark comedy requires all three elements. The Conway Twitty gag has none of them. It has no target. It has no perspective. Its comedic structure is simply, we are not giving you a joke. This is not dark comedy. It is the absence of comedy, framed as a joke about the absence of comedy. And the fact that the show produced this repeatedly and was praised by part of its audience for doing so suggests that a portion of the audience had stopped expecting the three elements, had accepted extremeness and the absence of conventional comedy as sufficient substitutes for the actual thing. This is the end state of a long process of substitution. Satire substituted by transgression, comedy substituted by extremeness, character substituted by function, warmth substituted by cynicism. Each substitution happened gradually. Each was rationalized in the moment, but the cumulative effect was a show that had replaced genuine dark comedy with a simulacrum of it, something that wore the same clothes but lacked the essential qualities. What makes this worth articulating carefully is not to condemn the show or to suggest that none of the later content has value. It is to be precise about what was lost, because the loss of genuine dark comedy capacity in favor of shock value is a real creative loss, not just a moral or ethical one. Dark comedy is hard to do. It requires precision, genuine thought about what the target is and why it deserves to be a target, and genuine craft in the structure that delivers the observation. Shock value is easier. It requires only the willingness to go somewhere uncomfortable and the confidence that being there is enough. The shows that maintained genuine dark comedy capacity across long runs, South Park most prominently, The Simpsons in its best seasons, Arrested Development in its abbreviated one, did so through consistent commitment to having something to say. Each offensive moment was connected to an observation. Each dark joke served a perspective. The discomfort was always in the service of something, and that service was always visible to an attentive viewer. Family Guy's early seasons had this quality. The tragedy of its later seasons is not that they were offensive, they were always offensive, but that they increasingly were offensive without the quality that had originally justified the offense. Section 16. The legacy question: what Family Guy actually changed? Having traced the decline of Family Guy's satirical integrity and the escalation of its offensive content across its run, it is worth pausing to acknowledge what the show actually accomplished before and during that decline. Not to soften the preceding analysis, not to suggest the failures were less real than they were, but because a fair account requires the full picture, and the full picture is more complicated than a simple verdict of decline. The show ran for over 25 years at the time of its most recent renewal. Very few creative enterprises of any kind, books, films, television series, musical acts, sustain themselves at any level for that long. Most things end much earlier. The ones that keep going face a specific and interesting set of challenges. How to remain relevant when the culture has moved. How to maintain creative energy when the original circumstances that generated that energy have changed. How to serve an audience that has grown and changed alongside you, while also being legible to new viewers who arrive without the context of everything that came before. These are genuinely hard problems. The fact that Family Guy has not solved all of them, or has solved some of them poorly, does not mean the attempt is without value. The show also exists as a document of a particular era in American television. If someone wanted to understand what animated comedy sounded like in the early 2000s, the specific cultural anxieties it engaged with, the topics that felt edgy versus the topics that felt genuinely transgressive, the relationship between comedy and political commentary at that particular moment in American life, Family Guy across its seasons would be one of the most useful documents available. Not because it reflects those things perfectly or accurately, but because it responded to them in real time, and the responses, successful and unsuccessful, sophisticated and crude, are a kind of record. Having traced the decline of Family Guy's satirical integrity and the escalation of its offensive content across its run, it is also worth noting what the show managed to protect even through its worst periods. Because Family Guy did change things. Real things. The show's legacy is not reducible to its problems, and any honest account of what happened to it has to include the real achievements alongside the real failures. Family Guy proved that animated comedy could return from cancellation. This sounds modest, but was genuinely unprecedented. The mechanism by which the show came back: Adult Swim reruns, driving audience awareness, DVD sales demonstrating commercial interest, the combination of these two signals convincing Fox to reverse its cancellation was novel and has been influential. Shows that would later fight for revival through similar combinations of streaming presence and demonstrable fan loyalty were fighting battles that Family Guy had already won first, establishing that canceled shows had avenues to redemption that had not previously existed. Family Guy also demonstrated the commercial power of what became clip culture before clip culture was a recognized phenomenon. The show's format was accidentally prescient in a way that McFarlane and the original writing room could not have anticipated. They designed the cutaway gag as a comedic device for television. What they created turned out to be a native format for a media landscape that did not yet exist, one in which audiences would consume enormous quantities of short, shareable, self-contained video content. The cutaway gag, which worked as a bonus joke within an episode, also worked as a standalone post on a content platform. The format scaled down without losing its essential appeal. This was genuinely unusual. Most television comedy requires context. The joke lives in a scene, which lives in an episode, which lives in a season. Family Guy's most famous jokes could be extracted from all of that context and still work. That quality was commercially valuable in ways that shaped how the show was made, and it also influenced how subsequent creators thought about designing comedy for the emergent digital media environment. The show's renewal through 2029 effectively guarantees that it will reach its 30th anniversary still in production, an achievement shared by almost no other animated comedy in television history. Whatever its current creative standing, the institutional durability of Family Guy is itself a form of achievement, demonstrating something about what animated comedy can sustain over the long term if the commercial conditions support it. The show's format brief, self-contained comedic moments that could be extracted from their episode context without losing their essential comedy, made it the perfect content for a world in which media consumption was moving toward short-form sharing. The show essentially previewed the era of content designed for clips and shares several years before that era was fully upon us. That preview was commercially important and culturally influential in ways that rippled well beyond the show itself. The show's influence on subsequent adult animation is also real. The wave of animated comedies that followed Family Guy shows that adopted its irreverent tone, its willingness to engage with offensive material, its mixture of pop culture reference and family sitcom structure owe something to the space the show carved out and defended. Some of these shows improved on Family Guy's model in various ways, American Dad being the clearest example, eventually surpassing its sibling in quality by maintaining what Family Guy lost. But the space existed partly because Family Guy had demonstrated that the specific mode of comedy it pioneered was commercially viable. Brian and Stewie, at their best in the Road to episodes, in Brian and Stewie, in Christmas Guy, represent a genuine creative achievement in the writing of animated friendship. The relationship between these two characters, developed over many seasons with genuine care, is one of the most fully realized animated relationships in the history of American television. The episodes that centered on their friendship demonstrated that the show's talent was real, deep, and capable of producing something genuinely moving. That these moments were surrounded by content of considerably lower quality does not diminish their existence. The show's musical numbers, often overlooked in analyses that focus on its controversial content, were frequently excellent. The song You've Got a Lot to See, from Road to Europe in Season 2, is genuinely beautiful. Various other musical moments across the show's run showed a level of craft and genuine affection for the musical form that was surprising and rewarding. MacFarlane's voice and his evident love of mid-century American popular music gave the show a musical dimension that most animated comedies did not attempt and that Family Guy usually succeeded at. The show's engagement with American cultural nostalgia, particularly its celebration and parody of 1970s and 1980s, pop culture through Peter's particular reference points, was often genuinely insightful and funny. The specific texture of American middle-class male cultural formation in that era was rendered with a precision that required genuine thought and genuine affection for the material. These are real things. They are not enough to redeem the show's worst content, but they are also not nothing. Family Guy's legacy is complicated precisely because its achievements are real and its failures are real, and neither cancels the other out. What the show's full arc most clearly illustrates is the difference between a creative vision and an institution. In its early seasons, Family Guy was a creative vision, MacFarlane's specific way of seeing American culture, rendered through the specific characters and specific humor that his vision generated. In its later seasons, Family Guy was an institution, a system for producing content that carried the name and some of the DNA of that original vision, but operated according to the logic of institutional inertia, commercial incentive, and the accumulated habits of a long-running production. Institutions can produce good content. Institutions can produce genuine art. But institutions produce it differently from creative visions, and the differences are visible in the output. The early show felt made. It felt chosen. Every element had been considered and placed deliberately. The later show often felt manufactured, produced, competent, reliably filling the slot it occupied. Occasionally brilliant, frequently just adequate. The distinction between these two modes of production is one of the things that the full arc of Family Guy most clearly illuminates. The question of whether the show should have ended sooner, whether there was a correct moment at which it should have been wrapped up, is a genuine question without a definitive answer. MacFarlane himself has acknowledged that there was a time when he thought ending the show was the right call. He did not make that call. The show continued. Whether the continuation was net positive or net negative for the show's legacy is something reasonable people can disagree about. What is not disputable is that the show that aired its 27th season, which the April 2025 deal guaranteed, is a different show from the one that premiered in 1999. Not just in the natural ways that any show changes across a long run, but in the specific and traceable ways that this one changed. The warmth that thinned and largely disappeared, the satirical structure that collapsed into extremeness, the characters who became shadows of their original selves, the cutaway format that swallowed the storytelling, and the offensive content that escalated because the incentive structure pointed consistently in one direction, and the mechanisms for pointing it elsewhere gradually weakened. That is the complete story. And understanding it, having the patience to sit with all of it, to follow the trajectory through all its seasons and all its decisions and all its consequences, gives you something that the casual viewer does not have: the ability to see exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it means about the specific challenges and specific pressures that any long-running creative enterprise faces. What you have just heard is the full arc of one of the most complicated stories in animated television history. From a warm-hearted, edgy, brilliantly constructed comedy that premiered to 22 million viewers on Super Bowl night in 1999, to a show that continues to air on weeknights, watched by a fraction of that audience, maintained by institutional momentum and commercial logic rather than creative passion, still occasionally capable of something genuinely moving, and still regularly capable of something genuinely troubling. The show that Seth MacFarlane built and the show that carries his name today are the same object in only the most technical sense. The characters share names and voices. The setting remains fictional and New England adjacent. The family still eats together and argues together, and occasionally in the best episodes loves each other in their inarticulate way. But the particular thing that made the early show what it was, the careful balance of transgression and warmth, offense and heart, darkness and care, that thing is much harder to find now. It shows up sometimes. It shows up in the episodes that remind you why you started watching in the first place. And then it goes again, and the show returns to what it has mostly been for a long time: a machine for generating content, still running, still producing, still occasionally surprising you. The show's deepest irony is that it became a victim of its own success in a very particular way. The success of the early seasons created the conditions that made the later seasons possible. The massive Adult Swim rerun viewership, the DVD sales, the passionate fan community, all of that brought the show back from 2 cancellations and gave it the commercial platform that kept it alive for decades. But the very things that saved the show also changed it. The viral clip culture that made Family Guy ubiquitous on early YouTube created an incentive to make clips rather than episodes. The passionate, transgressive fan community that fought for the show's revival expected transgression as proof of authenticity. The commercial success that made the show profitable enough to continue made it profitable enough to continue even when the creative case for continuation was weak. Every mechanism that saved Family Guy also shaped it, and the shaping, cumulative over many seasons, produced something that the mechanisms of salvation had not intended and the original creator had not designed. There is a smaller irony nested inside the larger one. The show's greatest creative achievement, the Brian and Stewie friendship, built with real care across many seasons, emerged not from the original concept, but from the transformation of that concept. Evil Stewie could never have had the relationship with Brian that soft Stewie eventually developed, because Evil Stewie's relationship with everyone was transactional at best and murderous at worst. The warmth of the later Stewie-Brian dynamic required the softer Stewie, and the softer Stewie required the retirement of the original. So, the single most defended creative achievement of the show's middle and later seasons came directly from the creative decision that many fans found most disappointing. That kind of complicated reality where the things that went wrong produced some of the things that went right is characteristic of creative enterprises that run for a long time. Nothing is purely one thing. The failures create conditions for some successes, and the successes create conditions for some failures. And the whole thing is less like a story with a clean moral than like a long, complicated life with regrets and achievements so intertwined that they cannot be fully separated. What you can do, what this entire account has attempted, is trace the choices clearly. Not to condemn the people who made them, who were navigating complex pressures in real time without the benefit of knowing how things would turn out, but to see them as choices, specific, consequential, made by specific people for specific reasons, producing specific results that then created the conditions for the next choice. The show did not simply drift toward greater offensiveness through some impersonal process of entropy. It was steered there by real decisions made by real people in specific circumstances that this account has tried to describe. Understanding that clearly, understanding that it was a choice rather than an inevitability, is what the title of this analysis actually points toward. The show did not get more offensive every season because shows always get more offensive as they age. It got more offensive because of specific creative, commercial, and institutional decisions that consistently pointed in that direction. Some of those decisions made sense at the time. Some of them were mistakes from the moment they were made. All of them were choices. And understanding them as choices is the only way to understand the full arc of what happened to one of the most genuinely original, genuinely brilliant, and eventually genuinely troubled animated comedies in the history of American television. That is the story of how a show gets more offensive every season. Not through malice, not through conspiracy, but through the compounding of small choices, the drift of institutional momentum, the reward structure of a clip economy, and the gradual thinning of the creative vision that once gave all of it a center. Each season moved the line a little further. Each season, the new position became the floor. And across 25-plus years of that process, a show that started with genuine warmth and genuine satirical ambition became something substantially different, still occasionally capable of the thing it once was, still carrying the name and the voices and the family, but operating at a distance from its own best self that no amount of self-awareness fully closed. If this was worth your time tonight, a like takes 1 second, and a subscribe costs you nothing. Both of them mean the next one finds its way to you. Thank you for being here. Take care of yourself, sleep well,